Chapter 266. The person in charge of tracking the red race track reported to his superiors and sent over the video he just captured. It didn't take long before he was notified that they didn't need to adjust the speed of the cameras on this race track. They sent another person to track the veg fritter. At the same time, the League of Stars Media and the Sizer family's research team were tracking all the flying cars in the race. Of course, they noticed Sillin and the others as well. Naimi was participating in the race. Even though Veg Fritter's performance wasn't great at the beginning, they still sent someone to track it. It wasn't because they were hoping that Veg Fritter would perform well, but because they wanted to be the first to react if something happened to it. It looks like Naimi isn't as good as we thought he was, one of the organizers said. Another person agreed. That's true. This is their true strength, isn't it? It's not that no one came up with a circular design back in the day. It's just that no one was able to utilize the advantages of that design to their fullest potential. That's why Veg Fritter was eliminated back then. But it's obvious that the racer in it can handle the circular design. If I recall correctly, the circular design is a combination of electromagnetic effects and manual control. It's so that a flying car can turn faster using its external rotation. But that was always thought to be just theory. I didn't think that I'd see it in action one day. The control of the spiral and firing angle is practically perfect. Someone pointed at the clearly slowed down video on the screen and said, if I remember correctly, there was a Veg Fritter that used scaly propulsion in its design back then, right? The others fell silent when they heard the word scaly propulsion. A dozen or so seconds later, someone said, if the scaly propulsion is really based on the original design, then it's only a theory. Since a theory had become a reality, no one could say for sure if the scaly propulsion was still a theory. The flying cars that were derived from the original Veg Fritter and some of the newer models all adopted the scaly propulsion concept. However, they weren't able to use it in the race like the original design did. When everyone realized the illogical aspects of the design, they had no choice but to make some modifications. The modified design was no longer called the scaly propulsion. Instead, it was given a different name based on the type and style of the car. Arrow's shuttle-shaped flying car, Vanguard's blade-shaped flying car, and Lightning's crescent-shaped flying car were all equipped with a secondary propulsion system based on the scale-shaped propulsion system. Arrow's shuttle-shaped flying car had auxiliary propulsion systems similar to the pelvic fins, pectoral fins, and caudal fins of a fish. Blade's and Crescent Moon flying cars also had auxiliary propulsion systems that matched their models. The auxiliary propulsion system would allow the flying car to go faster, but at the same time, it required the driver's driving skills to be higher. The slightest bit of carelessness could lead to unimaginable consequences, and in serious cases, the car would be destroyed and people would die. Of course, this was also the thrill of the competition. By now, Sillin's group had caught up to the three flying cars in front of them. One of them had made a momentary lapse in acceleration, probably because it was too nervous and distracted by Sillin's Veg Fritter, and crashed into the wall of a spiral curve. The flying car's safety measures were pretty good. At the very least, the two people in the car weren't in mortal danger. Logisticians would come over later to carry them out for treatment. This wasn't the first flying car to make a mistake since the start of the race. There were a few more flying cars before it, but most of them performed pretty well. Sillin's Veg Fritter continued to pull further and further away from the other two flying cars in the passage. This passage was supposed to be the longest, and it had the most spirals and nodes. It was only natural that the racers would have to spend more time and energy to deal with it compared to the other tracks. But at this rate, while the technicians were analyzing Veg Fritter's situation, Naimi was even more surprised than they were. Naimi knew that Veg Fritter could fly very fast, but that was only if it was flying in a straight line without many obstacles. Right now, it was facing spiral curves and nodes. The flying car barely slowed down at all when it passed through the spirals and nodes. By now, Naimi was slowly recovering from his shock. He checked the official status of this track and the current overall ranking. There's a chance, there's definitely a chance. Sillin was controlling the steering wheel with one hand and adjusting the control panel with the other. But to Naimi's surprise, he couldn't see Sillin's movements at all, no matter which hand he used. Naimi's vision was a blur even if he focused all of his attention on it. Silen's driving ability was far better than they had imagined. How many more spirals and nodes are there? Silen asked, but his eyes never left the front window. Naimi took a deep breath and calmed himself down. He looked at the situation and said, excluding the one we just passed, there are 73 spirals left. 29 of them are continuous spirals with more than 3 rings. There are 17 nodes, 5 big nodes, 12 small nodes, and a 4-ring spiral in front of us. The parameters are... Naimi's legs were shaking a little even though he was explaining the situation in a clear and organized manner. His fingers hadn't warmed up yet, but he was no longer as terrified as he was before. It was replaced by indescribable excitement. This is what it means to be a racing car, a real racing car. Naimi didn't need to analyze too much. In fact, he felt that Silen could fly perfectly even if he didn't have a navigator. The 2 flying cars on the same track were completely left in the dust, and Vegfritter was overtaking one car after another in the overall ranking. The audience was starting to realize that the antique flying car was starting to show its might. When there were 33 spirals left on the red track, Vegfritter was at 41st place. When there were 19 spirals left on the red track, Vegfritter was at 11th place. When there were 7 spirals left on the red track, Vegfritter was only behind the top 3 seeds and was at 4th place. Right now, the spectators outside the track and elsewhere were going crazy. First, it was the red track, and it was known as the unluckiest track of this term. Second, it was an antique Vegfritter that was said to have been abandoned by history a long time ago. Third, it was because no one had ever heard of this dark horse before. All the flying cars and racers who were invited to the Winds of Freedom had participated in a lot of relatively influential races in their respective star regions before they were invited to participate in the Winds of Freedom. Everyone more or less knew about such a character, but this racer was so unfamiliar that no one had ever heard of him before. This wasn't an illusion. Everyone had been paying attention to Vegfritter since it caught up to them, far more than they had been paying attention to the top 3 seeds. It didn't look like a human could pass through the spirals and the nodes at that speed. At the very least, no one had ever seen such a thing happen in their lives. Is he cheating? Someone asked. How can anyone cheat like this? Can you show me? This is too fucking unbelievable. According to the original plan, Zhen Xingming's group was supposed to move to the next circuit midway through the race. However, Silen's Vegfritter showed off its might one after another, so Zhen Xingming's group decided to stay where they were. This was the only place where they could watch Vegfritter's surveillance footage and analysis. At first, no one was willing to leave, but as the race progressed, no one asked to leave anymore. Zhen Xingming stepped on the mountain of shelves at the edge of the stands and pointed at Vegfritter's footage with one hand on his waist and the other. He announced loudly, "See that? That's my bro." This sentence was obviously meant to show off, unlike the previous one which was mainly a warning. There were 3 spirals left on the red track, and it was impossible to say who would be the first one to make it out of the red track. There were more races left on the red track than the other 3, but no one could say for sure right now. Everyone sped up and fought to be the first to make a good start. Naimi's heart was pounding as he stared at the ranking and the race map on the screen. He didn't say anything to Silen, and Silen didn't ask how many races were left either. He simply charged out of the red track at high speed. He knew the rest of the race and the curves. Whoosh! There wasn't much of a difference in the time it took for the 4 flying cars to charge out of the passage at the same time. Arrow's flying car was the first to do so, Spearhead's flying car was the second, Silen's Vegfritter was the third, and Lightning's Crescent Moon was the fourth. These 4 flying cars stirred up the audience's emotions. The 5th car was still some distance away from the first 4 cars. At the very least, it wasn't shown on the same monitor at the entrance of the race. 25 points. Although it wasn't the first place's 40 points, Naimi was more than satisfied with the result. After all, they had chosen the unluckiest track of this year's race. In fact, Naimi wondered if Silen would have won first place if he had accelerated without considering his own adaptability at the beginning of the race. Naimi felt very ashamed when he thought of this. He was a burden to the team. Get ready for the second circuit. Sillin interrupted Naimi's thoughts and adjusted his car's condition swiftly. The next circuit was a rainforest zone. 2 walls of light were separated by 100 meters of distance, and there was a height restriction after the official second circuit. This meant that the race would be much more difficult than before. After rushing out of the passageway of the first stage, everyone knew their ranking and the ranking of the others. However, they didn't have much time to express their thoughts. Everyone was trying their best to rush to the second stage, and this was the time to close the gap with the others. However, when everyone gathered at the same track at the same time, they discovered an obvious problem. The Vetschfritter charged forward like a bolt of lightning. It was so fast that everyone who saw it without the aid of a monitor couldn't help but feel goosebumps all over their bodies. Had that guy always raced at that speed? Arrow, Spearhead, and Lightning Seed sped up in unison after being imaged by Sillin's Vetschfritter. In the past, they were the only 3 pilots, so they wouldn't charge at full speed according to strategy. But now that an extreme guy was charging ahead of them, their pride wouldn't allow them to do so. As a result, the distance between the top 4 and the rest of the racers gradually widened. Some of the unlucky ones who had chosen a worse track were also chasing after them at full speed. Everyone's ranking was changing except for the top 4. Tobia and Chiosu's pyramid flying car was in the 30s when they exited the track, but it was now 28. They hoped that they could push a little further into the second circuit. Sillin was currently ranked first, but Naimi could see that Sillin's expression hadn't changed since the start of the tournament. It was something that Naimi admired very much. He guessed that Sillin was either a legendary expert or a robot. Otherwise, there was no way he could remain so calm. Didn't he say that he had never participated in a race of this level before? The second circuit started just like Sillin's test drive. They flew a certain distance away from the forest. The 3 cars behind them prepared to activate their special sound waves and magnetic waves at the same time. These waves would affect the rattan trees and birds, so they only needed to deal with a few of them. But Sillin was different. The waves Sillin ordered Vetschfritter to release were at the same frequency that everyone thought was useless. It was the same frequency that the isolation net emitted, and it would keep the animals away from the area and focus on the plants. Most of the time, plants cause more trouble than animals. That was why the people who received Vetschfritter's waves didn't understand why Sillin was doing this. But they understood the reason in the next moment. After Vetschfritter released its frequency, the giant bird that was flying towards them turned around and flew towards the other flying cars. The rattan trees and some of the moving plants below them also started to move. It was at this moment a ring of jagged wrist blades popped out of the edge of Vetschfritter. The jagged edges spun and cut through the vines that were hurled at them in an instant. At the same time, the surface of the flying car turned incredibly smooth after a flash of lightning. Some of the plants that managed to avoid the jagged edges slid off the flying car, because their cilia weren't strong enough to hold onto the car. Only plants with leaves that looked like suction cups managed to wrap around the flying car, but the jagged edges of the flying car would be able to cut through the vines if it tilted the slightest bit. That was why Vetschfritter was able to cut off the rattan trees wherever it flew. And the culprit was able to escape without a moment's delay. This was the plan they had discussed, but Naimi felt that something was wrong. It was different from what he had imagined. It was even faster than he had expected, and the pressure from the people around him was making him very uncomfortable. Sillin wasn't racing, it was more like he was venting. Naimi didn't understand why Sillin was acting like this, and he didn't dare ask. Right now he thought that Sillin was terrifying. Although he was expressionless, serious, or smiling, he still felt unusually dangerous. Sitting less than half a meter away from Sillin in the navigator's seat, Naimi didn't dare to breathe too loudly. He didn't need to give any flying advice, because Sillin might be more familiar with the terrain and environment than he was. Or maybe Sillin didn't care at all, and he treated everything the same way no matter where he flew or who blocked his way. Vetschfritter's jagged edges resonated with a lot of flying car enthusiasts. They didn't care if the design would affect the car's flying ability, but it was a scene that made many young racers' blood boil. Some people chose to dodge the rattan trees, and some chose to face them head-on. However, the latter would undoubtedly slow down the car, and it was a difficult choice to make. That being said, this gear-shaped design might be a good choice. It wouldn't slow them down too much, would it? Can't you see that I'm still flying as fast as I can? Vegfritter had to be very fast, but it wasn't flying in a straight line. Instead, it was flying in a curved line, and the car's tilt would change constantly to make sure that no tree branches would wrap around it. The car's surface was smooth, but it couldn't stop the suction cups and some of the more unusual plants from passing through. Every flying car was equipped with some machinery to deal with unexpected situations. There were also bandsaws and gears, but they were all small gears that popped out of the car and weren't as effective as Vegfritter's. Vegfritter was as slippery as a fish in a sea of trees. It slipped out of the tentacles of a predator and bit if it couldn't. The second circuit wasn't just a test of the racer's driving skills, it was also a test of a flying car's ability to deal with similar situations. This was a circuit that allowed the use of weapons. There were all kinds of weapons, and the spectators would vote for their favorite weapon after the race was over. This was a rare data gathering method for the Sizer family. The second circuit was the shortest out of all 7 circuits. After passing through the sea of trees, Sillin and the others were the first to exit the circuit. Spearhead's flying blade was second, Lightning's crescent moon flying car was third, and Arrow's flying shuttle flying car was fourth. Just like before, the 4 flying cars weren't too far away from each other, especially the 3 flying cars behind them. Vegfritter and the other 3 flying cars were just a little bit bigger in comparison to the rest of the group. This was the advantage and disadvantage of different car models. Different car models would have their own advantages and disadvantages in different circuits. 40 points. We have 60 points now. Naimi was very happy, but he didn't get carried away just yet. After all, only 2/7 of the circuit had passed. It didn't take long for them to enter a dark world after passing through the sea of green trees. A pillar of mud shot high into the air, signaling the start of the third circuit. This was the dirtiest circuit of the race. After all the flying cars had flown out of the forest, 2 people appeared at a corner of the forest and said something to each other before vanishing into thin air. The only sound left behind was the rustling of footsteps. Chapter 267. In front of them was a dark swamp. They couldn't see how deep or shallow the swamp was. Some places were bubbling with mud, and when they got closer, they could even hear the bubbling sounds of mud bubbling. The tall mud pillars were only sprayed out from the deeper parts of the swamp. The mud was very dense and viscous, so it would be very troublesome for the flying vehicle to be sprayed with it. If the mud couldn't be brushed off in time, the vehicle's speed would be affected, and its balance would be destroyed. Sillin drove the car through the mud pillars. Tilting the car to a certain angle would give it more space to dodge the mud pillars. The 3 cars behind them were in hot pursuit, and the other cars were gradually catching up to them. Perhaps their disadvantage was over, and the people behind them would catch up to them. Every stage was a new ranking process. There were a lot of racers who hadn't gotten a single point yet, but they weren't anxious. They were obviously veterans, and they knew which stages were their strengths, and which were their weaknesses. As long as the flying vehicle wasn't destroyed, there would always be a chance for them to make it to the top. We have 65 points right now. The third place of the Rainbow of Beginnings has 25 points, and the first place of the second circuit has 40 points, so there's no need to rush. We just need to play it safe, Naimi said. Sillin replied with a MN to indicate that he understood. Naimi used the car's omnidirectional cameras to search for hidden dangers, places that would make it easy for the car to accelerate, and points that needed attention to be paid to Sillin. There was no need for him to explain anything else. Sillin could do it all by himself. When one of the mud pillars collided with the other pillar that was shooting out diagonally, the mud inside the 2 pillars erupted in 2 different directions and covered the entire area. No matter what happened, Sillin's flying car would be splashed with mud no matter what. The brownish-black mud slammed against the flying car, leaving clear traces of high-speed splashes. A white light flashed, and the splashed mud on the surface of the flying car instantly froze at an ultra-low temperature. Then, the surface of the flying car was shattered by the supersonic shattering effect of the flying car's surface, turning it into powder and flying away from the car. This was a common method used by flying cars, and some of the cars behind them used a similar method. However, It wouldn't be so easy for some unlucky racer to crash directly into the mud pillar. If they didn't react in time, they would be stuck to the mud pillar, and the enormous pressure and stickiness would drag them straight into the swamp. Naimi felt that Sillin was a lot calmer than he was in the rainforest. Maybe it was because he hadn't calmed down from the start of the race. The flying car's dodging skills were very good, and there were many times when Sillin was able to slip through the gaps between 3 mud pillars. Although he couldn't avoid getting splashed with some mud, it was still better than the flying cars behind him that crashed into the mud pillars as long as he could stabilize the car. Spearhead's flying car had caught up and overtaken Vegfritter, but Sillin didn't look like he was going to speed up. Then Arrow and Lightning's leading cars overtook him. Naimi noticed that Sillin's expression was the same as before. He didn't look pleased with himself when he was at the front, nor did he look anxious after being overtaken. Again, the guy was as calm as a robot. Although Sillin's eyes were staring straight ahead, Naimi felt that there was something else hidden in Sillin's eyes. If Sillin was filled with a long-suppressed emotion back in the rainforest circuit, then it was an unfathomable depth to him right now. It was like flying away from a planet and looking at the endless starry sky. Still, Naimi sat obediently at his seat and checked the layout of the circuit, reminding Sillin when necessary. Sillin didn't give chase immediately after he was overtaken. The leading car would be under a lot more pressure, and there was still some distance to go until the end of the circuit. That was why he maintained his original speed until he reached the back of the swamp. It was enough for him to stay in 4th place. He had already adapted to the environment and climate here. Every mud pillar would tremble slightly before it erupted, and he could feel the tremors through the flying car. He was able to determine where the eruption was coming from, what the general angle was, and how much it was going to erupt. Then he could react accordingly. He was like a carbon-based robot. His brain was performing calculations at every moment, and he was able to sense the energy fluctuations much better than Naimi's. It was exactly because he didn't understand how Sillin was able to react so accurately in such a short period of time that Naimi thought Sillin was amazing. It was at this moment the spectators finally realized that the 3-seated cars weren't the only ones fighting for the championship. The darkest black horse of this race, the antique Vegfritter, was also involved. The sprinting process was also a process of increasing the distance between the other cars. The first 4 cars had already pulled away from the 5th place by a bit, and there was no gap between them at all. However, 3 mud pillars suddenly erupted at the end of the circuit and converged at the top in a claw shape. Then the impact caused the mud to splatter down like an umbrella. The 4 cars had to split up, and Spearhead and Lightning's cars had to pull them up. Below them, Vegfritter and Arrow's cars had to look for an opening to pass through. It was through this different method that the top 4 of this segment were decided. Arrow was first, Sillin's Vegfritter was second, and Spearhead was 4th. Naimi finally let out a sigh of relief after he charged out of the circuit. 2nd place wasn't too bad. He was expecting 3rd or 4th place, and this was more than enough. There would be a repair shop set up at the end of every circuit, and every racing team had their own repair shop there. However, the first 2 circuits were only the beginning, so most of the flying cars hadn't stopped for maintenance yet. Now that the 3rd circuit was over, some flying cars finally started flying over for quick maintenance. After all, there was no room for error in the next circuit. A flying car had to have a self-detection index of 9. 5 or above, not even 9. 0. The first 4 flying cars didn't stop. They all sped up and charged forward. The dark swamp and the miasma at the bottom slowly disappeared as well. The 4 cars made a big turn and flew in a different direction. There was a hint of white on the horizon, and the temperature display on the flying car told him that it was getting colder the further they flew. It was because that was the planet's polar region. He stuffed an energy supplement into his mouth, chewed on it, and gulped down the water Naimi passed him. Sillin looked into the distance and estimated that it would be night by the time they reached the polar region. The drivers and navigators took advantage of this time to replenish their energy. The navigators explained the general situation of Saida to the drivers and confirmed some countermeasures. The navigators also had another role, and that was to calm the drivers' emotions. They had to keep them in a stable state no matter how good or bad their results were in the previous circuit. Just as Sillin predicted, night had fallen by the time they reached the fourth circuit, the snowy glacier. The starry sky looked great, but the wind on the ground was the most disharmonious. The wind blew the snow that had fallen on the glacier all over the place. It wasn't snowing, but it looked even worse than snow. It was a snowstorm that didn't come from the sky. There were also some tiny pieces of ice mixed in with the wind, and it was very easy for a high-speed flying car to experience the same situation as Tobia and the others last time. Because the surface of the car wasn't protected properly after repeated collisions, the parts would loosen and cause a series of reactions. Tobia and the others were still fine. Because of this, many flying cars would undergo maintenance and reinforcement checks before the circuit to ensure that there would be no undesirable situations in the snowy glaciers. Flying cars couldn't fly too high. There might not be a snowstorm at high altitudes, but there was a much lower temperature than a snowstorm. The air pressure there was different from the air pressure near the ground. Someone had once experimented at that altitude, and a robot had flown a flying car up there. It didn't take long for the entire car to freeze, its energy system crippled, and its thrusters destroyed. This was a special phenomenon at the planet's polar region, so the flying cars wouldn't fly too high during this circuit. Of course, flying at low altitudes wasn't easy either. Because of the glacier, the airflow didn't have a fixed direction, and the wind that was deflected by the glacier could send a flying car flying. Therefore, the safest way was to drive on the ground. Every flying car in the race was a tricycle. No matter how good they were at flying in the air, they could still drive on the ground. The flying cars sprung out of their spiked wheels and sped across the snowy ground. Compared to their flying speed in the previous circuits, they were moving at a snail's pace. Among these flying cars, there was one exception, and that was Vegfritter. The other flying cars sprung out of their wheels to drive on the ground, but Vegfritter had sharp teeth growing out of its sides when it flipped over. Unlike the wrist blades of the rainforest, these sharp teeth allowed it to drive better on the icy ground. It was round in shape, so it looked like a big wheel. The edges turned, but the center didn't. The Sillin didn't want to follow this wheel. At the same time, Vegfritter's sharp teeth weren't the only things around it. There were also a lot of small wheels that balanced the airflow. These wheels weakened the airflow and provided Vegfritter with some mechanical energy to drive through the snow. The icy ground wasn't completely smooth, or they would have been sliding on it already. There were many cone-shaped protrusions on the icy ground, and they would run into them if they were to slide. As the flying cars sped across the icy ground, on the other side of the glacier, on a glacier not far from the cursor's track, 5 blurry figures were outlined by the strong wind and snow. However, when these people shook off the ice and snow, they could not see any of them. All that was left were the shadows left by the strong wind and snow. They were invisible. 30 minutes left. An emotionless voice rang in the air. As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of crushed ice could be heard. However, it was hard to hear in such an environment where the wind was howling. A while later, 20 minutes left. The voice suddenly paused. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The special bullets flew through the wind and flew towards the 5 people. Bang! The bullets were stopped by a protective barrier about 10 centimeters away from the 5 people and shattered. 6 people appeared 100 meters away from the 5 people. Sula was one of them. The Gen family? The 5 people on the other side also revealed themselves. Unlike Sula and the others, their equipment wasn't layered with layers of protection. They didn't wear thermal clothing, bulletproof vests, or breathing masks. They only wore a thin layer of clothing and pants, but they didn't feel cold at all. Sillin felt like he was being watched from many sides since the start of the race. Sula and the others were definitely one of them, but who was the other? Sillin thought that he was just a minor character in the Miss Bodhisattva Empire. Even if he knew the Sea Blue Gold formula and was connected to the Gen family, he couldn't be as important as a true noble family descendant like Gen Xingming and the others, could he? Moreover, Gen Xingming and the others were in a group of 4. If someone really wanted to cause trouble for the royal family, they would be the perfect targets. However, Sillin was the one who was in trouble right now. Before this, Sillin had only wanted to use the flying car race to vent his emotions. After all, there were a lot of things that had been bottled up in his heart for a long time. Sometimes he would think of the people in Vanguard Division 6, and sometimes he would think of that idiot Long, Night, and Ci Jincheng when he saw Jin Xingming and the other rich kids. It was a conditioned reflex from his memories. Sometimes Sillin would wonder if he really couldn't go back. Would he forget those people after a long time? Would he return to his life on planet Brown Earth? There was the wilderness here, and there were new people here. However, there was no sense of belonging. Genya said that he would get used to it, but every time Sillin heard Huimao talking in his sleep, he would think that no one could deny a person's memories, not even a cyborg like him. Genya had returned home, so where was his home? Was it this galaxy that still seemed unfamiliar to him? While he was thinking, Sillin suddenly narrowed his eyes and looked in a certain direction. What's wrong? Naimi noticed that something was wrong with Sillin just now, and was about to warn him, but he was caught off guard by Sillin's sudden movement. Sillin didn't say anything, but he frowned and looked to the front. No one knew what he was thinking. On the other side of the glacier, Sula and the others were in a bad situation. They thought that they would be able to handle the situation with these people, but things were much more troublesome than they imagined. Communication was cut off, and they couldn't call for backup. 4 of the 6 people they brought were injured, and 2 of them were seriously injured. What do we do? Her companion asked Sula when she saw the charging robot. Sula didn't turn around. Her broken saber was stuck in the ice, so she couldn't pull it out just yet. She quickly calmed her breathing and prepared to fight the robot with her lightsaber. At this moment, a white light flashed, and the robot that was rushing over was sliced in half. Sula looked at the person who had suddenly appeared at the robot's position, and let out a sigh of relief. The person had white hair, white eyebrows and black and white circles around his pupils. He looked like a snowy field at night. Chapter 268. Crack. The last robot was cleaved in half from top to bottom. White Knight withdrew his blade of light. He wasn't wearing a protective suit like Sula and the others, but he didn't seem to feel the cold at all, just like the robots. Sula and her companions performed basic first aid on their wounded teammates. After confirming that their lives were no longer in danger, Sula walked up to White Knight. "Why are you here?" White Knight shot her a glance before kicking the chopped robots to a corner. He said expressionlessly, "Teacher Guan." Sula looked surprised for a moment before understanding dawned on her. As expected, she couldn't hide anything from Guanfeng. "Thanks. You're the only one?" Sula had just asked this question when she saw a snowy white wolf over 150 centimeters tall running toward her. It didn't look disheveled even though it was running in the middle of a snowy field. Instead, it exuded a kind of murderous elegance. When one looked into its eyes, they would discover that it was a proud wolf. It was as if it was giving you a lot of face just by looking you in the eye. "Rubel. Who's with you?" Sula was truly shocked when she saw the snow wolf. She had no idea how these people were alerted. What on earth was Guanfeng thinking? What on earth happened? "Why are you?" Sula looked at White Knight. White Knight put on a protective suit and said in a low voice, "It's so cold." Sula. "So you can feel the cold after all." White Knight was a human too. He wasn't a beast covered in thick fur like Rubel, and he wasn't a robot either. It was just that wearing a thermal suit, protective suit, and breathing mask would affect his movements, and White Knight didn't like to be restrained. That was why he didn't put on the protective suit until he was done with the robots. Rubel was still holding something in its mouth. It was something it had taken out of a robot's head. It ran to White Knight and spat it out, saying, "So hard, much harder than before." The robots Sula and her team had encountered were only a small part of them. There were other robots left behind in the glacier zone, so White Knight and Rubel split up to chase after them. Sula shot a glance at Rubu the snow wolf who was crouching next to her. That bastard was opening his mouth wide and pulling at the badly deformed skin that he had bitten off from the robot with his claws. Sula asked White Knight again, "How many of you are here?" Bai Yi did not reply. He walked over to the snow wolf that was picking its teeth with its paw and patted its head. "Let's go." The people around Sula were very angry at White Knight's attitude. Although White Knight had helped them just now, he was still a very irritating person. He was about to step forward and say something when Sula stopped him. Sula shook her head and motioned for him not to do so. She knew White Knight's way of doing things. Let's leave for now. The situation has changed. Let's contact our superiors and see if there are any new instructions. Oh right, let's collect the remains of those robots as well. They might be useful, Sula said. When Sillin drove the flying car past the glacier, he noticed that there was no one there anymore. Both White Knight and Sula had already left, and the place where the battle had taken place was buried in snow. At first glance, there was no trace of the battle, but there was a very long crack on an iceberg next to it. It was a testament to the battle that had taken place here. Naimi, you drive, Sillin said. Ah. Naimi was caught off guard for a moment before he reacted. Why? I'm tired. Oh, but my abilities are limited. I'll probably be overtaken. Naimi knew his limits. Right now, Vetchfritter was temporarily in first place, but the flying car behind it was still hot on its tail. It's fine. Let Vetchfritter help you. After that, Sillin made a few settings on the control panel. Then Sillin and Naimi's seats changed. Naimi accepted the controls nervously while Vetchfritter cooperated with him. After Sillin left the driver's seat, he started working on the navigator's analysis panel. His fingers moved swiftly as he typed in a series of characters. At the same time, many small screens popped up on the analysis panel. Every small screen displayed a different thing. Some showed wave frequency analysis, some showed image analysis, and so many lines of data that Naimi's eyes were dazzled. After a quick glance, Naimi turned his attention away from Sillin and focused on driving. Sillin had deduced a lot of things through the analysis device installed on Vetchfritter. He knew that the robots had appeared here, and he had located the place where they appeared. He had taken video clips from the media and the Sizer family's surveillance cameras and processed them, and he saw the crack on the iceberg. Other than that, Sillin had also located the place where the snow wolves had chased after the robots. So Sula and the others had come here to deal with Black Viper's robots? There were a lot of details that Sillin didn't understand, but there was one thing that Sillin was clear about. He had sensed the robots at the rainforest earlier, and they had appeared again during this circuit. That meant that they would definitely appear in the rest of the circuits as well. He didn't know if Sula and the others could stop the robots though. While Sillin was analyzing, Naimi had already started sprinting. The circuit was almost over. It was nightfall when they arrived at the glacier circuit. Now that the circuit was almost over, the sky was starting to brighten up. Although Naimi had tried his best, he still wasn't as good as the veterans at adapting to the minute changes in the environment. However, thanks to the advantage Sillin had created at the front, their score wasn't bad at all. They were in second place. The first place of this circuit was Lightning's crescent moon. Arrow's flying shuttle was in third place, and Spearhead's flying blade was in fourth place. After the fourth segment ended, there weren't many flying cars that stopped for maintenance. The next segment was a vast desert. The fourth circuit and the fifth circuit could be said to be polar opposites, but it just so happened that the unique terrain and environment had created such a unique circuit. The flying car was still greeted by a sea of white after it charged out of the glacier. Even though it had flown a long way out of the glacier, it was still white from the window. However, when you looked at the temperature displayed on the car, you would notice that the temperature outside wasn't like the glacier at all. It was about the same temperature as the human body. The white was all sand. White sand. The white sand zone was a transition zone between the glacier and the desert. White sand was everywhere in this zone, but the temperature wasn't as high as the center of the desert. It could be said that the temperature here was comfortable, and the air humidity wasn't too low either. Do you want to switch, Sillin? Naimi asked. To be honest, although he had made a small mistake during the sprint and didn't get first place, Naimi's interest had been piqued. He really didn't want to switch at the moment. Being a racer was much more exciting than being a navigator. No need. Continue. Sillin's words delighted Naimi. Don't worry, I'll do my best. As they continued to fly, the white sand gradually turned into yellow sand. The temperature outside also rose sharply. It wasn't too bad inside the flying car since it had a thermostat, but it wouldn't take long before they turned into dried corpses. He couldn't help but sigh at the tenacity of the natural world. Sillin saw some animals moving through the sand on the car's display. They were so small, so tenacious, and they didn't rely on any machines. They relied on their own adaptability and ability to evolve. Sillin finally noticed an unusual ripple from the analysis screen. It was an unusual ripple that belonged to the robots. It was similar to machine language, but it was disrupted so he couldn't understand what it was trying to say. Sillin tried to locate it, but he discovered that he couldn't pinpoint its exact location. It could be the robot's own interference, or it could be someone else's interference. Either way, there were robots there. It was exactly because he had seen what those robots were capable of that Sillin wasn't in the mood to pay attention to the race at all. What was the point of racing if he was going to die? Fleck had seen Vegfritter's blueprints before, and Naimi was guarding Vegfritter, while Sillin was assembling it. However, neither of them knew that Vegfritter was actually equipped with a very hidden weapon system. It was a relatively independent weapon system that was protected by multiple passwords. Right now, Sillin was activating this weapon system again. The weapon system wouldn't affect Naimi's driving much after it was activated, and he didn't even realize that another dangerous program had been activated on the flying car. Since Fleeka's materials were limited, and the production cost was also limited, the weapon system on Vegfritter couldn't really do anything to the robots. It could only buy them some time. Sillin still had some weapons in his ring, including the Purgatory Thunder Snake K and related bullets. He sucked in a deep breath. He couldn't place all his hopes on Sula and the others. Sillin had to plan a way out for himself. Naimi was a member of the Sizer family, and he was getting better and better at driving after the initial awkwardness. He might not be as good as Sillin, but he wasn't far from it. Coupled with Vegfritter's own smart controls, the 4 flying cars were still in the lead. To most people, this was already a miracle. An outdated car model, an eye-popping antique Vegfritter, had shown enough and won enough recognition in the last 4 circuits. Of course, only those who knew the ropes would know that not everyone could drive a Vegfritter to this level. While Sillin was getting ready to deal with the robots, the abnormal fluctuations on one of the analysis screens suddenly stopped. It was as if the robots didn't exist at all. Sillin stared at the screen for 2 seconds. Then he swiftly tapped on the other screens to analyze the abnormal fluctuations. In the end, he performed multiple comparisons between the analysis results on the screens, and the result he got was that the robots in the area he had circled earlier were really gone. There were some tiny mechanical fluctuations in other parts of the desert, but they were all far away from the core. Or rather, something must have happened to the robots in the area Sillin circled on the screen. They were either killed by Sula and the others, or someone else. The rest of the robots had fled into the distance. Who could it be? As he got closer and closer to the coordinates Sillin had circled, Sillin paid more and more attention to the changes in this area. He stared closely at the screens in front of him. If a mechanical fluctuation appeared on these screens, Sillin would have to respond immediately even if he had to forfeit the race. The good news was that he didn't detect any mechanical fluctuations here. Instead, there were signs of organic life. It wasn't a native species of the desert, but an alien species. However, because the other party had a jamming device, Sillin couldn't confirm who or what the other party was. That being said, Sillin wasn't as nervous as he was before. The other party had probably killed the robots. If it wasn't Sula and the others, then it was someone else. At the very least, it couldn't be an enemy force. The desert was filled with flying sand, and it was impossible to see what was going on outside through normal vision. However, Sillin could still see a round object not far away from the track through the sandstorm. It was about 2 meters in diameter. The sandstorm had almost buried it completely, but the parts that were exposed were gradually showing scales. After the flying car had flown away, Sillin also vaguely saw the round ball shake off the sand after they had flown away and roll towards a certain direction. It was at a sandstone area in the desert. The tall sandstone blocked the vicious light barrier, and the temperature in the shadow was much lower. Moreover, there was no violent sandstorm here. There was a person lying in a narrow crevice. The person was wearing a sun hat, and the brim of the hat was pulled down low to block the small amount of sand that was rolling towards them. His clothes were tattered. It was hard to tell if they were from a fight or torn by himself. But it was probably both. The person was using his arms as a pillow, his legs crossed and swaying leisurely. The half-rolled-up pants on his thighs swayed with his movements like rags. He looked very relaxed. Not far away from the sandstone, the sand pushed by the wind had buried something. However, it wasn't completely submerged yet. An object at a small corner reflected the light and shone with a metallic luster. If one listened closely, they could even hear the tiny buzzing of electricity underneath the sand. However, the buzzing grew weaker and weaker until it completely stopped. Glug glug glug. A spiky ball rolled over. It was the round ball that Sillin had seen before. The ball got stuck when it rolled into the crevice. Then, it rolled back a bit and charged into the crevice again, only to get stuck again. After a few tries it finally gave up. If it tried to force its way in like this, it would probably topple over all the sandstones in this area. The spiky ball finally stretched out and revealed its full appearance. It was an armadillo lizard nearly 5 meters long. After stretching its whole body, the armadillo lizard shook off the sand and stones on its body and swaggered into the crevice. It wasn't stuck now. Fong Fong, everything went well. We can start by hand now, the armadillo lizard said to the person sleeping inside. The person called Fong Fong let out a long sigh, as if he was regretting that his leisure time was over. He raised his finger to push the brim of his hat up, revealing a pair of small, narrow eyes under the hat. He glanced at the armadillo lizard that had crawled in, then yawned, stood up slowly, and stretched again. Let's go. Hand by hand. The man and the lizard walked out of the stone area and into the sandstorm. It didn't take long for them to arrive at a small sand dune that wasn't too high. The man raised his hand and patted a part of the sand dune, shouting, "Open the door, we're back. The sandstorm outside is so strong." The patting didn't sound like the patting of a sand dune. As the man patted the sand dune, the layer of sand outside was blown away by the wind, revealing a shell that looked no different from yellow sand. It was the shell of a spaceplane. However, the camouflage, color, material, and sand covered the surface of the spaceplane made it look like a small sand dune. The man shouted and patted for a long time before the spaceplane's hatch finally opened. The man and the lizard entered the spaceplane, and the hatch quickly closed behind them. Inside the spaceplane's cockpit, a little girl who looked to be about 7 or 8 years old was playing a game. She didn't react to the man and the lizard's entrance at all. Her eyes were fixed on the game screen, and her hands were moving non-stop. It was a driving game, a flying car game developed by the Sizer Company not long ago. When the armadillo lizard was about to lie down and rest, the little girl finally spoke up. "Armadillo, you brought in a lot of pollutants again. You'll be responsible for cleaning the spaceplane next time." The armadillo armadillo's crouching motion froze, and then the huge scales on its body that looked like armor almost exploded. "Why? I was the one who cleaned up the spaceplane last time. It's your fault that you didn't shake off the sand when you came in." The little girl's eyes were still fixed on the screen, but her words were directed at the armadillo lizard armadillo. Armadillo rolled his eyes, then raised his tail and pointed at the person lying weakly on the chair. He said to the little girl, "Nikki, I want to report that guy Fong Fong was slacking off today, and I did almost all the work. Look, a piece of scale on my tail was shaved off, and my tail was almost cut off." The person who was lying on the chair sprang up and pointed at his ragged clothes and trousers that were already in the shape of tassels. He complained in an aggrieved tone, "Nonsense. Look at me, these are all traces of battle. I almost ran around naked. You have to help me, big sis Nikki. You have to give me a raise this time." It was strange that a young man who looked to be in his 20s would call a little girl who looked to be 7 or 8 years old, big sis. Nikki snorted while playing the game. "Chi Lafong armadillo, you two clean the spaceplane together next time." "You're wrong. I'm serious. I'm really working hard. Look at my sincere eyes if you don't believe me." Chi Lafong moved closer to Nikki and pointed at his own eyes. The little girl finally put down the game in front of her and turned to look at Chi Lafong. She tried hard to find the sincerity in his eyes, which were as thin as a thread even when his eyes were open. Then she came to a conclusion. "Your eye ulcers are particularly prominent today." Chi Lafong didn't feel awkward when he heard this. Instead, he raised a finger and touched the inner corner of his eye. That's right. I've worked so hard on this hot day that my eyes are dry and tired. They might even get inflamed, or maybe they're already inflamed. It's not easy for me. I need a raise, and a holiday too. It'd be best if I could get a reimbursement for my travel expenses. Armadillo, who was resting on his stomach, twitched his tail and buried his head in silence. After a moment of silence, Chi Lafong suddenly stared at Nikki's pointy ears and said, "Hey big sis Nikki, you're already 35? You were 34 just a while ago. How come you're 35 now?" Nikki's ears were sharper than most people's, and there was a ring of teeth around her ears. The number of teeth represented her actual age. Chi Lafong's exclamation was followed by a thump inside the spaceplane, followed by Chi Lafong's scream. The desert circuit went relatively smoothly, and Silen's team was still in the top 4. Naimi was incredibly excited, and his nervousness was nowhere near as intense as before. He had picked up his speed as well, but he was still defeated by a centimeter despite being in a good condition. The third place was Arrow's flying car, the second place was Lightning's crescent moon, and the first place was Spearhead's flying blade. 5 out of 7 stages of the race had passed, and the final score of the top 4 was as follows. Arrow's flying shuttle 150 points, Lightning's crescent moon 145 points, Silen's veg fritter 145 points, and Spearhead's flying blade 140 points. There wasn't much of a difference between the 4 cars, and anyone could have won the race. There were still 2 more circuits to go, and no one could tell what would happen next. Naimi looked a little depressed after exiting the 5th circuit. Moreover, he had maintained a high level of nervousness and concentration, so he was severely dehydrated and exhausted after the race. Right now Naimi admired Silen more than just a little. After all, he had only flown 1 circuit, and Silen had flown 4. If a racer had to maintain this level of concentration in every circuit, then the racer was truly a capable person. In fact, Naimi suspected that the reason why there was a driver and a navigator was partly due to the fact that not everyone could drive from start to finish. This was a long-distance race, and those who didn't have the ability or tenacity to participate in it would only suffer even if they did. Naimi had participated in long-distance races before, but his competitiveness was limited, and the difficulties he encountered weren't too big. That was why he was able to persevere. But now that he was participating in the Winds of Freedom, he could only sigh. He needed more experience. In the past, Naimi and a bunch of noble children would drive their flying cars from one circuit to the next on the safe road. At the time he thought that it was so easy. Isn't it just driving a flying car? Isn't it just a long-distance race? Bullshit. Naimi insisted on stopping his flying car at the repair point. After that, he sighed emotionally at Silen and told him his thoughts. "It's fine, Silen. You do it. I'm not good enough yet." Silen thinks for a moment. "All right, I'll take over from here." Silen and the others weren't the only ones who went to the repair point for repairs. Almost every flying car that had completed the 5th circuit had to go to the repair point for repairs. The 6th circuit was an underwater circuit, and it would be suicide to fly into the sea if something happened to a flying car. The rescue team wouldn't be able to arrive in time every time, so it was better to be safe than sorry. The repair point was where Spearhead's motorcade was. Since the top 4 cars were leading the pack, the other cars were still lagging behind a little. Tobia and the others hadn't arrived yet when the flying car arrived at the repair point. The person in charge of Spearhead's repair point was busy ordering people to perform an emergency repair on their flying car. Inside the car, Dagny, the current captain of Spearhead, was chatting with his navigator teammate. "Something's wrong with that veg fritter. It's still fast, but it doesn't give me the same thrilling feeling," the navigator said. Dagny nodded in agreement. "Indeed, it's like it's a completely different person." Suddenly, both of them recalled that the navigator of that flying car was Naimi of the Sizer family. Naimi was young, but he had participated in many flying car races. He might not have participated in a big race like the Winds of Freedom, but at the very least he had the experience. Piloting a flying car wasn't a problem at all. "So you're saying that the young master of the Sizer family, Naimi, is that it? It should be him." "But Danny, Do you think the driver will change back to the kid who drove before in the next two most crucial stages? It's possible. No, it's very possible. He'll definitely switch back if he's not injured again. We need to work harder. That guy's just too crazy. Similar conversations were taking place in Arrow and Lightning's cars. Everyone was thinking about the switch at the same time. The last two circuits were the decisive sprint of the race. Let's go. The 4 flying cars arrived at the repair point at about the same time, and the maintenance time was almost the same. The only difference was that Naimi's car was a little behind the others, so he was a little behind when he was done with the repairs. But it was just a little. When the 4 flying cars left, there were still more flying cars that arrived one after another. This was the gap between the 4 of them. The cursor that drew the flight path extended diagonally from the cliff to the side, and then disappeared into the sea. The 4 flying cars had already adjusted the parameters and relevant settings before entering the sea, so that the flying cars could move better in the sea. Vegfritter's scale-shaped propulsion system was also activated. However, it was in underwater mode right now, and its propeller had been switched to a different gear to greatly reduce the water's resistance. The most troublesome part of the journey was running into those big guys. Although they had cleaned up the area before the race, there was no telling if those big guys would come after them. Moreover, the flying cars weren't flying in the deep sea, so the chances of them running into those big guys weren't very high. Speaking of which, they had run into similar situations in the past. If they ran into those big guys in the sea, they couldn't fight them head-on. The only way to avoid them was to waste some time. And even if that time was very short, 1 second was more than enough for the flying car in front of them to leave them in the dust. The sea was beautiful. There weren't many industrial facilities on this planet, and there wasn't much man-made pollution. Coral reefs were everywhere, and all kinds of strange little fish and underwater animals looked very lively. The sea wasn't quiet at all. In fact, it was quite lively. Sillin didn't forget to look at the scenery in the sea while he was driving. For him, this kind of scenery always stirred up an uncontrollable emotion. Countless colorful underwater characters existed together, and the coral reefs looked like a carnival. It was rare for Sillin to see such a beautiful and natural living system. Swaying like a flower or solid as a rock, the corals are the playground and home of these sea creatures. A giant sea turtle was swinging its front limbs leisurely. A giant grouper was swinging its tail clumsily and letting the little fish clean the parasites in its mouth. A goby and a bulldozer shrimp were working together, one as a bodyguard, the other as a cave builder, and they were sharing the same home. This was what Sillin saw. Every time he saw something like this, Sillin would always think back to the era when people talked about these things like myths on TV. After walking out of the planet, Sillin saw a lot of mythical scenes. They were all purely natural scenes, and not man-made or heavily made up with technology. However, there were some people who would never be able to see these things again. Naimi was shocked because Sillin had opened up 3 viewports. One was showing the situation at the front of the racetrack, one was showing the coral reefs not far away, and the last one was showing a wave pattern that he couldn't understand. It was exactly because Naimi had driven the car himself that he was so shocked right now. 3 viewports. Sillin, you can't do 3 things at once. Every time a flying car brushed past a big fish, Naimi's breathing would slow down a beat. Really? You really make people worry too much. While Sillin was driving, observing the underwater world, and paying attention to the unusual waves, on the other side of the sea, the coast. As the waves rolled toward the beach, a figure emerged from the water and slowly walked up to the beach. The person was still covered in scales, and some of them were broken. Blue blood was still flowing out of the wounds that weren't serious, but they quickly scabbed over. After leaving the water, the person shook his arm and grabbed the thing he had taken out of the robot's head. The person walked up to the shore while cursing. The scales on his body gradually disappeared, and he looked more or less like a human. Fortunately, there was no one here, and no one would see this strange person walking naked on the beach. After looking around and making sure that there was no one around, the strange person took out a communicator out of nowhere. He didn't turn on the image projection, and only communicated with his voice. "Hey, it's me, Sadia. I'm done here. Yeah, I know no one noticed me. I know, I have to pay attention to my image, right? Do I look like that kind of person to run around naked? Don't push the blame on me for the immoral things. Yes, I took the best sample. I'll send it to you later. Sigh, it's nothing much, just a few cuts, deep to the bone, and a lot of blood. I'll definitely get a raise this time. I'm not lying really. Didn't you notice that Hagrid is unusually blue today? This time, Scylla didn't notice any abnormal fluctuations in the machine language, so the sixth circuit went pretty smoothly. If you ignored the giant octopus they encountered in the middle of the circuit, and the giant school of fish that appeared out of nowhere during the second half of the circuit, which was most likely a group of sharks that had teased them together, then everything went pretty smoothly. When the veg fritter that looked like it had been injected with steroids charged out of the sea and ended the circuit, the people in the 3 flying cars behind it thought at the same time. As expected, that racer is back. Alright. This is the last circuit, Scylla. Let's do it. Naimi was so excited that he couldn't sit still. He was just a young man in his early 20s, so how could he keep his cool at a time like this? Naimi scratched his head when he saw that Scylla was still looking as dead as ever. Compared to him, Scylla looked like a much older person. They were obviously about the same age, so why was there such a huge difference between them? This time he didn't stop. The flying car didn't need to go to the maintenance station for repairs, and Scylla already had a general idea of what to do with Black Viper's robot. He wasn't as worried and cautious as he was before, so he decided to end this quickly. Scylla opened all the scaly thrusters and moved his hands swiftly across the control panel. Naimi reflexively tightened his grip on his seat when he saw Scylla's reaction. His experience at the beginning of the circuit was so deep that it was no wonder he reacted like this. After thinking for a moment, Naimi stuffed a potion into his mouth for the first time since the start of the race. He had a feeling that it would be very embarrassing if he didn't do this. The reality was more or less the same as Naimi thought. The last circuit was filled with rocks, and crashing into a mountain wasn't like crashing into a sand dune. Crashing into a mountain was probably the end of the race. The closer they got to the end of the race, the more careful they had to be, or all their previous efforts would be for naught. The sky had turned dark again, and this made flying through the rocks even more difficult. Moreover, some of the light markers on the track would circle around the mountain, so the flying car would have to circle around the mountain a few times. If it wasn't handled properly, the best-case scenario would be crashing into a protruding part of the mountain, and the worst-case scenario would be crashing into the mountain and destroying both the driver and the car. The closer they got to the mountain, the shorter the flight path, and the greater the risk they had to bear. It was a technical job. That was why Naimi's heart almost jumped out of his throat every time he saw the flying car almost brush past the protruding mountain. Not only that, it kept happening again and again. Naimi checked the data again, and discovered that the flying car was less than 5 millimeters away from the protruding mountain. There were plenty of people who could achieve this under normal circumstances, but this was a race. Moreover, Scylla's driving speed was as fast as he had been at the beginning of the circuit. Naimi felt like he was about to faint. He also felt nauseous. Was this the legendary car sickness? The Sizer family would definitely laugh their heads off if they found out about this. A member of the Sizer family actually got carsick? Bullshit, right? Naimi wasn't the only one who thought it was ridiculous. The other flying cars behind him were also in disbelief. Who would have thought that someone would be bold enough to fly through the last circuit at such a speed? Was he trying to sprint, or was he trying to die? Every time Scylla flew the flying car over a mountain, the people who stayed at the finishing point would celebrate once. Although it was already nighttime, the image on the giant screen had been processed. Every flying car was marked with an eye-catching fluorescent label, so everyone could see the silver fluorescent light that flashed by was the veg fritter. Zhen Xingming was yelling charge harder and faster at the top of his lungs. He didn't care if Scylla could hear him or not. The people around Zhen Xingming didn't care how many times Zhen Xingming yelled, "That's my bro," either. It was like a night of revelry. Brielle stared at the giant screen at the center of the circuit for a long time before letting out a low chuckle and shaking his head. The people around him didn't know what Brielle was thinking, but they all knew that Brielle, Naimi, and a kid had made a bet, and it looked like the antique veg fritter was going to win this race. If that was the case, Brielle's would lose 100 million MB. 100 million. That was several years' worth of pocket money for them. If they lost, they would have to go begging. It was only natural that they would be in a bad mood after losing so much money. That was why no one dared to speak carelessly for fear that they'd run into the muzzle of a gun. Brielle suddenly rose to his feet, causing the people around him to shiver a little. But he didn't pay them any attention. Instead, he said to a servant beside him, "Prepare the money." "What about the general?" "I'll talk to him." "Yes, young master." Brielle's waved the others away after he was done talking about the money. Then he walked into his personal lounge and turned on his communicator. It didn't take long for the image of a person that both Sillin and Bell were very familiar with to appear on the communicator. Newhatch Tosin. "What's wrong? Is there something you need me to clean up after you again?" Tosin looked a little travel-worn in his military uniform, but he looked very energetic. He had probably just returned from training or a mission. Brielle smiled and said, "I lost money today, brother." Tosin was very familiar with his younger brother's words by now. He asked carelessly while cleaning the dust off his clothes, "How much did you lose?" 100 million. "That's not a lot." "How much?" Tosin crushed the cleaner in his hand with a crack, the veins on his forehead bulging. 100 million MB. Tosin sucked in a deep breath. "This won't do. I really want to kill that little bastard right now." Deep breaths, deep breaths, deep breaths. When he finally got his emotions under control, Tosin suppressed his anger and said, "Do you think our family does business like the Sizer family? You lost 100 million on a car race. Do you think 100 million is easy to earn? Do you know how much allowance I get from the military? Do you know how much I get even if I'm a dangerous person? Do you know?" Tosin suddenly realized that something was wrong after he said a series of "Do you know your brother? Do you know our father? Do you know our family?" In the past, the little bastard would have cut him off impatiently with a wave of his hand, but today something was very, very wrong. Tosin looked at his younger brother carefully. Although it was only a video, it was enough to see Brielle's abnormality clearly. "Are you being bullied?" Tosin asked tentatively. Money was money, and it could be earned back after it was spent. However, being bullied was not an option. It was a matter of a man's dignity. In his mother's words, it was a matter of a growing-up young man's mentality. Not to mention a young man whose mental development was already somewhat abnormal. Brielle shook his head and smiled. "No, I've just thought it through a little." He had always thought that his brother and father's refusal to let him drive a warship was just an excuse. Brielle's always thought that warships were warships, and flying cars were flying cars. How could they compare to a warship? A flying car was like a coward that could only stay on its own planet, and a warship was a hero. That was why Brielle's had never had a good attitude toward flying cars. Even his attitude toward Naimi, a member of the Sizer family, was unpleasant. But now, after watching a race like this, Brielle's felt like he had rediscovered something. He felt like time had stopped because of his own speed. It was like he had returned to the first time he saw a warship fly. It wasn't the flying car's fault, it was himself. If he continued to muddle along like this, he might end up like this for the rest of his life. He might end up watching others fly from the stands for the rest of his life. Far away at the 23rd MR, Tosin suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body. What did he just hear? Did his little bastard brother just say that he had thought it through? What the hell? Why, you're watching that flying car race right now, aren't you? Don't think too much, and don't do anything stupid. Just stay there and wait for me. Tosin clicked off the communicator and contacted the people around him immediately. They were the people his father had sent to protect Brielle's, but they didn't learn anything important from them. Tosin told them to keep an eye on Brielle's, and not let him do anything stupid. After contacting the people around Brielle's, Tosin immediately contacted his father at the imperial capital. The first thing he said was, "Dad, bad news." Brielle said he thought it through. "What? What happened to that kid?" "Send someone over to stop him from doing anything stupid." Brielle stared blankly at the disconnected communicator. Shouldn't he be happy that he had thought it through? Why was his brother looking at him like he was about to commit suicide? Deafening cheers were already echoing from outside. Brielles turned off the communicator after checking the message he had received. He then summoned his servants and subordinates and left the cheering venue. No matter how loud the cheers were, the stage was always someone else's. If he couldn't walk out of someone else's stage and live under someone else's stage, he would never be able to take a step forward. Zhen Xingming stepped over the people in front of him the moment Silin's flying car crossed the finish line. In order to avoid the audience's excessive enthusiasm, Silin drove his flying car to a special parking lot. He saw Zhen Xingming running toward him excitedly the moment he stepped out of the door. Belle and Iliganua were following closely behind him. Silin was about to greet them when he saw Sula's figure. Sula made a gesture and gestured for Silin to come over. Silin nodded and received the fist-like congratulations from Zhen Xingming and the others. After that, Silin excused himself and said that he had something to attend to. Zhen Xingming didn't give Silin a hard time after he saw Sula and the others waiting at the side. He let Silin pass for now. After Silin left, Zhen Xingming and the others turned their attention to Naimi, who was still in the car. "Hey Naimi, come out and see what's going on. I can't calm the violent excitement in my blood, even if I shout 3 times. Yeah Naimi, come out now. Let's go party. Naimi, go receive your award. Receive your award. Put on your shiny dress and go for a walk outside." Naimi looked up when he heard the chatter outside the car. His face was still a little pale, but he couldn't hide the excitement in his eyes. "I want to go party too, but my legs are numb after sitting in the car for so long. Let me catch my breath first. I'm not a robot like Silin." It wasn't that his legs were numb, but his legs were weak. However, Naimi couldn't say it out loud. The numbness in his scalp reminded him of the thrilling feeling of escaping from between the teeth of the devil in the stories. If he hadn't taken the medicine beforehand, he probably would have fainted already. On the other side, Sula led Silin to a room. "Black Viper's men did come here this time, and we've come to help you under orders. However, the one who truly helped you is your teacher, Guanfeng." Silin saw a couple of unfamiliar faces and 2 animals when he pushed open the door. Chapter 269. The first thing Silin saw when he pushed open the door was a white-haired man staring at the screen of a receiver in his hand. The receiver was playing the live stream of the race. A young man in tattered clothes was sleeping on a couch. Another young man was rocking his head back and forth while listening to some unknown song on his headphones. There was also a little girl who was completely absorbed in her game. All of them had one thing in common, and that was that they were minding their own business. They didn't even look at Silin's direction. A pack of snow-white wolves was lying on the other couch. They only twitched their ears once when Silin entered the room. The one who reacted the most was the armadillo lizard. Silin had an impression of it. Although it was only a brief glance, Silin was certain that it was the spiky ball he had seen in the desert. The armadillo lizard looked up when Silin entered the room. It wagged its tail and stared curiously at Silin. Silin had never seen this lineup before. Although he knew that they were from the affiliated schools, these people were very different from the ones he had seen in the past. Compared to the people Belle had brought to the bar with Dusk, the Soul Sentinel, they were much more imposing. However, in terms of threat level, they were definitely not as threatening as these people. Sula walked out of the room after bringing Silin into the room. It wasn't suitable for her to stay here, because they were on different sides. If she stayed here, White Knight and the others wouldn't say a word. As expected, White Knight moved his gaze away from Silin after Sula walked out of the room. He seemed to be confirming the authenticity of his target, and not looking at a person. Once he was sure, White Knight took out a square object less than a quarter the size of his palm, and placed it on the table. He pressed it a few times, and the square object unfolded just like the Vanguard ticket Silin used back then. It was a certificate. White Knight passed the unfolded certificate to Silin, and Silin accepted it. It stated very clearly that these people would help Silin take care of the robots that came looking for trouble, and that Silin should focus on the race. If the mission was completed successfully, there was a place for the recipient to sign and swipe the card. While Silin was reading the proof, Qi Lafang, who was sleeping on a chair, suddenly stood up and said, "You'd better add a comment to this. Just say that we're not afraid of death, we're extraordinary, we've accomplished our mission beautifully, and we deserve a pay raise. Sadia had stopped listening to the music and moved closer to Qin Lai. Yes, you must state that we deserve a reward. Sadia had stopped listening to music and moved closer to Qin Lai. Yes, we deserve a reward. You couldn't use any other pen on the certificate. You could only use your finger. There was a sensor in the certificate. You could just move your finger and sign it. If you wanted to leave a message, you could also write it with your finger. After signing his name, Silin wrote, "Worthy of reward," in the evaluation column. Qi Lafeng and Sadia were so happy they couldn't close their mouths. After he was done, Silin took out his affiliated school student ID and waved it at the card swipe area. A beep later, the ID came into effect. It's done. Qi Lafeng took the certificate and shrank it back into its small form. He carefully put it away like a precious treasure. This was an important proof that he deserved a raise. Since we're done here, it's time for us to go back. We'll talk again next time. Sadia patted Silin's shoulder before moving closer to Qi Lafeng and whispering something. Either way, the two of them were grinning like scoundrels. They were probably discussing how to spend the money after the raise. White Knight also rose to his feet. Before he left, he said to Silin, "Teacher Guan wants you to meet him at his house after you're done here." "All right. Thank you. No need." Without another word, White Knight, Qi Lafeng, and the others left with the two animals. They completely ignored Sula and the others who were standing outside. After White Knight and the others were gone, Silin asked Sula, "Are they the ones who stayed behind?" Most of the students in the affiliated schools would join different factions while they were still in school. They would have their own direction after they officially graduated, and some of them would be pulled into the RAS. Even the RAS's affiliated schools didn't completely belong to the RAS. Other than these people, there were also very few people who chose to stay behind instead of joining other factions. They had a fixed salary from the affiliated schools, and they had many ways to earn extra income. This incident was one of them. Sula nodded. "It is them. I didn't think that Teacher Guan would send them here. It looks like the situation is much more serious than we thought." Sula had a lot of questions about this matter that she couldn't get answers to even now. She couldn't get answers from the robots, and she couldn't get answers from White Knight and the others either. Not all the people who stayed behind were tight-lipped, but White Knight and the others were notoriously difficult to deal with. Even though they had graduated a few years ago, the instructors still couldn't help but curse them when they were mentioned. It was a love-hate relationship. Sula introduced White Knight and the others to Silin, and told him that Zhen Liao had sent them here. At first, they only received a small amount of information and weren't sure. That was why they were sent here just in case. Now it seemed that there were a lot of things that even Zhen Liao didn't know. Those robots seemed to have been upgraded again. The core protection of their brains was harder, and the robots were more cunning. They had all evaded the RAS's newest defense net and detectors, but the RAS was still one step too slow. Even now, Sula couldn't confirm how many robots were left on this planet. Judging from the robots' abilities, they definitely had a chance to take Silin away if their target was Silin. But why didn't they do anything? Why did they give her and White Knight more time to intervene? It was fine if she couldn't figure it out. After all, Sula was just an executor herself. She should leave the brainstorming to her superiors. Zhen Xingming was already urging Silin to go over. The award ceremony was about to begin, and Silin had to go. "Please take care of things here as soon as possible. We will escort you and Her Highness back," Sula said. "All right." The venue for the award ceremony was at the finishing line. It had already been set up and was brightly lit. Even though it was nighttime, the surroundings were as bright as day. When Silin arrived at the award venue, Zhen Xingming hurriedly dragged him over. The first-place team would be photographed together with their flying car, and they would also have to give a speech. Silin pushed the job of giving a speech to Naimi. That guy was a talkative person anyway. This was a night of epical significance. From this night onward, Vegfritter was no longer the tragic character it used to be. After being buried for so many years, it finally stood at the center of attention once more, just like it did during its glory days. The audience in the main area were all cheering, but no one noticed that among the cheering audience, There was a burly man who was waving his arms and shouting with the people around him. His eyes flashed with light, just like the reflected light from the spotlights. At another part of the planet, a robot exited stealth mode and walked into an empty maintenance room. Things are over here. They've started moving as well. We don't need to expose ourselves any longer. We'll leave after they leave. All right. Both Sillin and Naimi received a huge sum of money after winning the race. Coupled with the money Brielle sent over after he lost the bet, Sillin was basically a millionaire overnight. The second place of the race was Spearhead's wind-carrying car. The car behind it was a pretty good one, and it seized the opportunity to take second place after Arrow's shuttle-shaped car made a small mistake. Arrow's and Lightning's cars crossed the finish line almost at the same time, but it was only almost. Arrow's car made a small mistake at the end and lost the first 2 places, but it was still slightly ahead and won third place. Tobia and Chiyosu didn't get into the top 10. This was only their first race, and it was a practice race. Their main goal was to familiarize themselves with the winds of freedom. Maybe they would be able to get a better ranking in the next race. What are you looking at? Tobia patted Chiyosu's shoulder before following her gaze. It was the place where the award ceremony was going to take place. Chiyosu's attention was drawn to the brightest stage at the moment. There was a Vetschritter flying car and the champion duo. Don't be discouraged, we're still young, and this is just our first race. We'll be able to stand there once we get used to this level of competition and work hard for the next race. 4 years will pass by in the blink of an eye. Tobia said. Chiyosu looked back and smiled but didn't say anything. Tobia suddenly thought of something and pointed at Sillin with wide eyes. Don't tell me you've fallen for that kid? Don't get your hopes up. My brother said that he's pretty close to some noble kids, and you know who they are. Also, he might be even higher than the people who invested in our team. Don't make wild guesses, it's not like that. Alright. Let's go see our team's medal. Tobia relaxed after confirming that Chiyosu didn't mean it that way. After all, their team didn't want to provoke too many nobles. They would only end up as cannon fodder in a fight between nobles. Chiyosu followed Tobia back to the team, but the emotions in her eyes were unclear. Suddenly, she moved her gaze to a certain part of the spectator stand. The brawny man who was waving his arms froze for an instant, but he quickly recovered. So troublesome. Chiyosu sighed quietly. No one heard Chiyosu's sigh because it was too noisy around them. Naimi was giving his acceptance speech due to excessive excitement during a series of dazzling awards ceremonies. The flying car that everyone thinks is trash is the Vetschritter. We didn't do well in this race, and all we did was fly a little more happily than the others. Our results weren't good, and all we got was a championship. Some of the people on the stands behind him wanted to slap him with their shoes when he said that. When the ceremony was finally over, Sillin was dragged to the post-race cocktail party by Zhen Xingming. A bunch of people passed out from drinking too much and collapsed on the ground. Everyone was taken away by their respective teams. Sillin grabbed Zhen Xingming by the arm while the Sizer family escorted the deliriously drunk Naimi, Uliganuo, and Kenensi to the Sizer family's lounge. When they came out, Sillin saw the people from Spearhead walking out of the party hall. Their gazes met Chiyosu's, and both of them looked away. However, Sillin was already starting to feel puzzled. Ever since he saw Chiyosu at the repair shop before the race, Sillin had a feeling that she wasn't a simple girl. At the time, Sillin thought that she would definitely get a good ranking if she was the one driving the flying car. At the very least, she would be in the top 10. But later he realized that Chiyosu was just a navigator, and their team didn't get any good results. Why was she hiding her strength? Sillin didn't understand. Moreover, when he met Chiyosu's gaze just now, Sillin had a strange feeling that the girl must know something. But that was it. Now wasn't the time for Sillin to look into Chiyosu's information. The next day, Sillin turned down Naimi and Flika's attempts to persuade him to stay and dragged the disgruntled Zhen Xingming and Sula's group back to the Zhen family. On the way back, Sillin checked Chiyosu's file and found a lot of fake traces. Most people wouldn't notice these traces, so the person who made them must be very skilled in this field. There was no tampering at all. Every piece of information could be proven in various ways, But when Sillin analyzed it logically and probabilistically, he discovered something strange. One strange point could be said to be a coincidence, but several strange points couldn't be right. It could only be said that her information was forged. What kind of person could forge her information to this extent? They didn't look like Black Viper, but Sillin had a feeling that there was some kind of connection between them. It was Sillin's intuition. An intuition without any proof. Sillin had been thinking about Black Viper and Chiosu all along the way. He didn't succeed in contacting Guanfeng either. Guanfeng had set up the auto-response system to reply to him every time. He didn't know what he was doing, but he heard that the Purgatory Thunder Snake S-Class was almost done. He was probably still working on it. When Sillin walked into Jenya's courtyard, he immediately saw the big guy inside. He couldn't help but notice it because it was just too eye-catching. That's the egg. Sillin pointed at the 50-meter-long guy in the courtyard. Right now, the big guy's mouth was open, and Huimao was ordering the servants to brush its tongue and teeth. The servants seemed to have gotten used to it by now. They weren't afraid of standing in the big guy's mouth and brushing its teeth. They even talked to it while brushing its teeth. Seeing that Sillin had returned, Huimao ran over with a smug catwalk and showed off. "Look, my pet. What do you think?" Sillin looked at the big fellow whose mouth was open but eyes were rolling in their direction and said, "This guy's appetite is pretty big, isn't it? Otherwise, how could he grow so crazily as if he was injected with hormones?" "It is, but second grandpa said it's nothing." Huimao flicked his ears and said, "Second grandpa? How dare you call him that?" "Oh right, I've thought of a new name for it, blue skin. It's because its skin is blue." Huimao jumped onto Sillin's shoulder and asked urgently, "What do you think of the name?" "I guess I'll just have to make do with it for now." Poor Blueskin's name was made do just like that. Sillin explained the general situation of the flying car race to Genya. He had covered most of the small details, but he was sure that Genya knew more or less about Sula's movements. That was why Sillin avoided the important details and focused on the trivial ones. "What? There's a prize. How much?" Huimao's eyes shone brightly as he slapped Sillin with his paw. Sillin ignored Huimao's paw and pinched the back of its neck. He told Genya that he was going back to his room to rest and left the yard, leaving Blueskin to play with the servants who were brushing their teeth. "Any news?" Sillin asked Huimao after he returned to his room. "No, we didn't get much useful information here. The Gen family didn't find anything either, but one thing is for sure. Those robots are definitely doing something." Sillin fell silent for a moment. "Come with me to meet Teacher Guan tomorrow." "For what?" Huimao wasn't very willing. "I have business with him." "Don't go if you don't want to." "Then let's go. We've stayed here long enough. It's time to go for a walk." In reality, Huimao was only concerned about the money in Sillin's pocket. He could also buy some fish biscuits on the way. "All right, let's go to AF1 tomorrow. I'll go make some arrangements first." He still had to tell the servants to feed the pets on time. Genya didn't say anything about Sillin leaving as soon as he came back. There was still work to be done at the affiliated school, and Sillin couldn't stay here forever. Blueskin was very reluctant to part with Huimao, but Huimao became much more obedient after giving it a few paws. "Be a good boy and stay at home. We'll bring you some food when we come back," said Sillin. "Blueskin, meow Sillin." Slapping Blueskin's head, Sillin said, "You're a sea beast, not a cat." Sillin brought the gray cat with him to AF1. The Gen family was there to escort him there. As for Gen Xingming and the others, they were still skipping classes. They wouldn't go to the affiliated school to listen to the teachers even if they were bored. It hadn't been long since he left AF1, but Sillin's feelings were noticeably different after he returned. Maybe it was because he had vented some of his frustrations, or maybe it was because he felt a lot more relaxed after experiencing the extreme speed of the flying car race. Most people who came to AF1 for the first time would think that the pace of life here was fast and busy. But Sillin didn't feel nervous at all. He didn't feel nervous at all. He was a lot more nervous than he was during a race. He drove the flying car to Guanfeng's house at the school's speed limit and parked in the yard. Sillin felt that something was wrong the moment he entered the yard. It was the same scenery as before, but there wasn't any sign of human presence. Was Guanfeng still at the research lab? Didn't White Knight tell him to look for him at Guanfeng's house? The door opened on its own after Sillin swiped his student ID, and Sillin walked inside. The house was empty, and the fish in the fish tank were still swimming happily. However, the whole house gave Sillin a very strange feeling. Chapter 270. Guanfeng liked to cook his own food, so there were a couple of kitchens in his house. But judging from the state of the kitchens, all the machines had stopped working. The housework robot stood quietly in a corner, and didn't react to Sillin's arrival at all. Not even its indicator light flashed. He turned on one of the baking machines, and found a half-baked Guan family special biscuit inside. The furnishings in the other places were all fine, just as he remembered. There was no mess, no traces of fighting. Sillin went upstairs to take a look. Guanfeng's bedroom, study and so on were all tightly shut, and there was a password set in place that prevented anyone from opening them. There were no signs of someone breaking in either. It was almost as if Guanfeng had vanished into thin air. When he returned to the living room downstairs, Huimao was jumping out of the fish tank with a fish in his mouth. He stepped on the fish's body with his claws and tore it open from head to tail. There was no flesh or blood. It was a mechanical fish. You want to fool me? No way. Huimao swallowed the entire mechanical fish and looked at Sillin. Where's Guanfeng? Sillin shook his head. I don't see him. His gaze fell to the sofa. There was a projector on the table in front of the sofa with a flickering indicator light. Sillin pressed a button, and the lights in the living room were turned off. The curtains on the windows were drawn shut on their own. The living room was plunged into darkness. A human figure appeared on the sofa. It was an ordinary-looking person who wouldn't stand out in a crowd, but Sillin knew that it was a robot. As for why he could tell it was a robot from a projection, Sillin could only say that it was intuition. Dear visitor, we are sorry that the owner of this place is unable to receive you. Our boss only invited him over to reminisce about old times. We do not know when he will return. If you are in a hurry, you may come to this place. A gigantic star map appeared behind the voice. The planets around it were lined up neatly, and it was possible to see the 20 or so star regions of the Empire clearly. Among these planets, there was one that shone especially brightly, and that was the planet the robot was talking about. However, if Sillin remembered correctly, this planet wasn't part of the star map he had obtained before. The star chart lasted for 5 seconds before disappearing. The robot sitting on the sofa also disappeared. The curtains opened again, the lights turned on, and the living room returned to its original state. Although the star chart had only appeared for 5 seconds, Sillin had already memorized it. After the preset projector was turned off, Sillin dimmed the lights in the living room once more and took out the star chart in his hand. Comparing it with the star map provided by the robot, it could be seen that the star map in Sillin's hands did not contain the one that had just been marked. There were a few other planets and a star in the area that weren't on the star map. However, all the other planets were pretty much the same. From the star map, it could be seen that gravity was pulling all the planets in the area toward the spot where the star had disappeared. This meant that there was probably a star there. The gravity image was still there, but the planets at the center of the area had disappeared. This area was just an inconspicuous corner of the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. No one paid attention to it, and no one bothered to look into its secrets. Of course, it was possible that someone had discovered it but failed to find the answer, or that the planet had disappeared while they were searching for the answer. Most of the people in the Mist Bodhisattva Empire, who possessed a star map of the entire empire, had the exact same star map as the one in Sillin's possession. There was no planet marked on the map at all. This meant that someone had erased all the records and star map traces of this planet, and every planet around it. Only the Mist Bodhisattva Empire's upper echelons were capable of such a thing. But who was it? Why would they do such a thing? Was it Black Viper's spy? Sillin didn't know, and he couldn't guess. He knew too little about the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. Right now, Sillin wasn't involved in the games between the upper echelons and the secret squabbles, and he didn't want to get involved either. However, Guanfeng's incident had given Sillin another idea. Sillin sat on the sofa and thought quietly. Huimao didn't disturb him, So he strolled around the living room out of boredom before sneaking into Guanfeng's kitchen to eat some biscuits. Not long later. Oh my meow. Silen's thoughts were interrupted by a strange, muffled sound that sounded like a cat being locked in a jar. What's wrong with you now? Exasperated, Silen got up and went to the kitchen. The first thing he saw when he entered was a furry butt wagging its tail. Huimao had stuck his head into a biscuit-making machine and was trying his best to pull it out. You're stuck? Silen walked over and helped him pull it out. Hey wait, don't pull it, I'm stuck. Huimao yelled from inside. Can't you transform into another form? Just as Silen was speaking, he was stopped by a click that came from inside. Then a few more clicks followed. After a couple more cracking sounds, Huimao finally came out with a face full of green biscuit crumbs and a round cylinder. This is the best I can take out. There's another box inside, so I can't take it out. Huimao licked his paws and wiped his face. There was another world under the biscuit-making machine. Huimao had discovered that there was something under the biscuit-making machine while he was eating, so he bit through the biscuit-making machine and tried to take out what was inside. Who knew that it would be so hard to take out? Silen held the small cylinder and gave it a look. He didn't know what was inside, and it would take some effort to open the cylinder. Right now, Silen didn't deal with the cylinder immediately. Instead, he looked through the broken bottom of the biscuit machine and looked at the box he hadn't taken out yet. Although it wasn't good to destroy something like this without Guanfeng's permission, they were in a critical situation right now. Silen took out his tools and dismantled the composite kitchenware. Then he took out the box inside. Just like the cylinder, the box was protected with a password and couldn't be opened immediately. What's inside? Silen looked at Huimao. I don't know. The outer shell is made of a special material, so I can't see what's inside. Huimao bit into another biscuit. You might get diarrhea if you eat these half-raw biscuits. I won't. It's not like I haven't eaten them before. Up to you. Come over and decipher the password when you're full. Silen picked up his tools again and reassembled the disassembled kitchenware. After eating the biscuit, Huimao cooperated with him and started deciphering the two items' passwords. He deciphered the cylinder first, and when he was done, the front of the cylinder opened up to reveal a blueprint. It was the blueprint of the Purgatory Thunder Snake S. I think I've seen something secret. Silen could more or less guess what was inside the box after he stuffed the blueprint back into the cylinder. Just as Silen expected, the box contained the Purgatory Thunder Snake S. The white body of the spear made people feel a sense of coldness, pure and cold. The muzzle of the gun was hexagonal. Silen thinks that it was a snowflake. There was a Purgatory Thunder Snake insignia and an S symbol on the gun. Guanfeng actually designed it in such a short time. Guanfeng was the only person who could put such a precious gun under the biscuit machine in the kitchen. Of course, no one would have thought that Guanfeng would leave the priceless Purgatory Thunder Snake S in a place like this. However, this also made Silen realize a problem. Guanfeng didn't even take the Purgatory Thunder Snake S with him. Did he leave in a hurry? Or did he not have a chance? Or did he not want Black Viper to know about this at all? Silen put away the cylinder and box and sat down on the sofa in the living room. What should he do next? Huimao rubbed his belly on the sofa and yawned in boredom. Suddenly, his ears twitched and he looked outside the door. Beep! The door opened, and a person walked in. It was a familiar face. Silen had seen him not long ago. White Knight. Silen looked at White Knight in puzzlement. Guanfeng must have set up an entry requirement for this place. Silen was allowed in because he was Guanfeng's student, but what about White Knight? How did he get in? White Knight wasn't surprised to see Silen here. He looked around before staying on top of the fish tank. One of the fish was missing. There was a mechanical fish inside. It's been taken care of, Silen explained. I know. I've been here before, but I didn't take care of it. White Knight walked over to the sofa and sat down. Snow Wolf Rubu followed him into the room. The wolf and cat immediately faced off against each other the moment they entered the room. Huimao had just rubbed his belly on the sofa, leaving only the small sofa on the opposite side untouched. White Knight had already sat down on the small sofa. Rubu wanted to lie down on the sofa, but the cat's smell irritated him the moment he smelled it. It was as if this place already belonged to someone. Huimao didn't feel embarrassed at all. He didn't move away from the sofa and looked provocatively at Rubu while wagging his tail. Rubu bared his teeth. Huimao flicked his ears and ignored him. Have you read the information inside? Sillin pointed at the projector on the table and asked White Knight. Yep. Sillin raised an eyebrow. He's this calm. Right now Sillin was really suspicious. Just who was this for? Was it for Sillin himself, or for White Knight? What are you going to do? White Knight asked. Sillin knocked his forehead. I guess I'll go take a look. What about you? I'll go. Because of Guanfeng. Because I'm bored. Sillin. It was true that Sillin wouldn't be able to handle Black Viper alone, but Sillin didn't want to ask the Gen family for help right now. Sillin didn't want to get too close to the Gen family other than Genya. And if he were to ask someone to go with him, would it be this guy? It was at this moment White Knight's communicator rang. What is it? White Knight answered the call and asked. Did you find him? I need money urgently. Sadiya yelled from the other side. No, but I've got news. Sillin looked at White Knight. Was he going to leak Guanfeng's whereabouts? Where is he? Is Teacher Guan hiding somewhere? He can't owe us our wages, even if he's Teacher Guan. Come here first. Tell Qilafeng and Nikki to come with me. We have work to do? Wait here, I'll be right there. After White Knight ended the call, Sillin asked him. Are you going to announce it to the public? No, it's just that it's suicide to go to Black Viper's place with just the two of us. Sillin thought for a moment and agreed that it was fine. White Knight and the others weren't too deeply involved with the other forces of the Empire anyway. They were on the free side, and it would be convenient for them to act this way without triggering a chain reaction. Sadiya and the others showed up very quickly. It was probably because they didn't get their money back due to Guanfeng's disappearance that they were full of resentment. You're the cat that made Dar cry? The armadillo lizard armadillo stared at Huimao, who was lying on the sofa and wagging his tail lazily. Who are you? Huimao countered with a question. Armadillo crawled over with a chuckle and introduced himself, and the snow wolf Rubel. Rubel ignored Huimao just as arrogantly as before. Huimao couldn't be bothered to deal with the big dog either. His attention was drawn to something else. Huimao twitched his nose and looked at Sadiya, who was sitting carelessly on the sofa next to him. What are you looking at? Sadiya tried to pinch Huimao's ear, but Huimao scratched him away. You smell like fish. Fish. Sadiya sniffed again. No, I didn't eat fish today. Huimao wagged his tail. I know you're a mutant. A mutant from the sea. This time White Knight and the others were surprised as well. They didn't expect this cat to be able to sniff out something like that. Sadiya's teeth had turned into rows of sharp fangs when he grinned. I'm a mutant from the sea. What do you want from me? Huimao yawned. What's so special about that? Stop being so cocky, Sadiya. Huimao jumped onto Sillin's shoulder. Are these guys coming with us to find Guanfeng, Sillin? Sadiya started yelling before Sillin could answer. What's wrong with Guanfeng? Does he owe you his salary as well? White Knight briefly explained the situation to Sadiya before turning off the projector and replaying the scene. I see. I happen to be a bit free lately, so I can take a look around. But I'll have to ask Guanfeng for a raise. Sigh, White Knight, if Guanfeng goes back on his word, you'll have to pay him instead. He's your teacher after all, Sadiya said. Guanfeng is White Knight's teacher? Direct teacher? Sillin really didn't know about this. So it made sense that White Knight was able to enter Guanfeng's house. In fact, Pastura had to call White Knight senior brother in front of him. That being said, White Knight didn't demand that of Sillin. He didn't care if he called him that or not, and he didn't even care about Goryo. The preset projector on the table had played it once when White Knight had arrived, and then played it a second time when Sillin had come in. After the third time, the preset projector was completely destroyed, and all the records inside were destroyed. Moreover, the star map image on it could not be copied at all. Interesting. I didn't expect Black Viper to be hiding in such a small corner. Qilafeng, who hadn't said much until now, suddenly spoke up. White Knight didn't answer. He looked at Sillin instead. We'll be going together. What's your plan? Do you want to join us? Of course. I'd be courting death if I went alone, Sillin said. Huimao rose to his feet. Me too. I'm going to teach those trash robots a lesson this time. Sillin could tell that White Knight and the others worked together quite often, and they knew a lot about the Empire. It would be a lot safer for Sillin to go with them. We'll kick you out anytime if you're a burden, Nikki said. No problem. White Knight and Sillin opened Guanfeng's warehouse with their IDs and took out some equipment and resources. At the same time, they brought out a high-quality flying machine. Sillin guessed that White Knight had been doing this for a long time, judging from how familiar he looked with the place. Speaking of which, it seemed that all of Guanfeng's direct students were more or less the same. They took Guanfeng's things with ease. Since they were going to Black Viper's territory, it was only natural that they would be away for a longer period of time. During this time, one of Sillin's courses was going to be tested. If he didn't take the test, he would fail the course. Guanfeng would never allow something like that to happen, and Sillin couldn't bring himself to fail the very first course. Therefore, he had to talk to the instructor before he left. Sillin had read through the reference materials Guanfeng had given him several times already, and there was no way he would fail the course if he took the test. Therefore, Sillin was going to apply to take the test early. The instructor was quite old, and it was rumored that he was as experienced as Guanfeng in the affiliated schools. His hair was white, and although his face was covered in wrinkles, they weren't as deep as a normal old man's. Maybe it was because he often attended classes, but his voice was loud and full of energy. The old man was very angry when he heard that Sillin was going to take the test early. I don't care how many things you have to do or what your background is. You're a student first and foremost, and a student should prioritize their studies. Students of AF1 shouldn't compete with those good-for-nothings of AF3 in terms of who lives a leisurely life. Sillin couldn't help but sigh with emotion at the instructor's words. As expected of an experienced teacher who had taught for so many years. He didn't even pause when he started talking, and his words were righteous. As an experienced educator and one of the few academicians of the Royal Academy of Sciences who had given more than 100 lectures, he never ran out of things to say. After enduring the old teacher's scolding that lasted for 2 hours without a single pause or repetition, Sillin finally got his wish to take the early test. The old teacher supervised the entire process to prevent Sillin from committing any fraud. Moreover, the difficulty of the pre-test questions was on the high side, but it was still acceptable to Sillin. He completed the questions without a hitch, and only one extended question took up a bit of time. The old instructor gave Sillin a mental score every time he tried to answer a question. When Sillin was done with the question, his total score was out as well. He didn't give Sillin any face at all. After a snort, he waved his hand and dismissed Sillin. He passed the test, didn't he? Sillin left the old instructor's place after he was done with this big problem. After Sillin left, the discontent on the old instructor's face turned into helplessness. What a troublesome matter. What the hell are you guys doing? There's nothing we can do about it. A young man walked out of one of the rooms in the old instructor's house. Do whatever you want. I'm too old to get involved. The old instructor walked toward the study with Sillin's test questions in hand. When he passed by the young man, he paused for a moment and said, "Don't go too far." "I know, don't worry." Chapter 271. Sillin and White Knight departed immediately after they were done with the business at AF1. They didn't tell Genya about this because it would drag the Gen family into this mess. Right now, Sillin had no idea how many people were involved in this mess, or how many higher-ups were involved in this mess. Sillin didn't know how many higher-ups of the Empire were involved in this mess at all. It was as if a drop of ink had fallen into a pool of water and melted into it. Although the water didn't look much different from before, the drop of ink did exist in the water. Although the star map inside the projector in Guanfeng's living room couldn't be duplicated, and the projector had self-destructed on its own, everyone had a good memory. They were able to recreate a new star map after the projector had self-destructed. Is there really such a place? Inside the spaceplane's control room, Sadia asked Sillin while staring at the partial star map projection in his hand. There should be. Even if there aren't any of those planets, there must be other planets in that place, Sillin said. You're right. I never noticed this place on my previous star map. How mysterious it is. Sadia poked at the marked spot with his finger. I wonder what's waiting for us there. Qi Lafong twirled his sun hat with his finger. Whatever it is, it's going to be troublesome. Oh right, I heard that Black Viper has a lot of robots. I wonder what level they're at right now. I'd be very disappointed if they're still the same as the scrap metal we ran into a while ago. Nikki, who was playing a game, shot him a sideways glance. Even if you're a pile of scrap metal, 1,000 of them will be able to turn you into a sieve with a single shot, not to mention that you're in Black Viper's headquarters. Write a will first, and when the time comes, divide up your remaining assets. Qi Lafong paused in twirling his sun hat and chuckled. I'm not willing to throw my life away for the unspent assets I haven't spent yet. Then be serious and don't screw up when the time comes. A man who can fall asleep in shooting class is seriously suspicious. Also, don't think I don't know that Armadillo was the one who completed most of the last mission. Shooting class is so boring, it would be strange if I didn't fall asleep. Secondly, you can't deny the fruits of my labor. I've also fought robots before. Nikki ignored Qi Lafong's nonsense and continued playing her game. Armadillo wagged his tail. This wasn't the first time Qi Lafong had fallen asleep during a battle. Hey, where are those two? Qi Lafong kicked Armadillo. Armadillo pointed at the door with his tail. They're patrolling their territory. Ever since they boarded the aircraft, Huimao and Ruble, the two guys who love to enclose territories, started to fight for territory. The spaceplane wouldn't allow them to spray their metabolites anywhere they wanted, so Wheeze habitually rubbed its own scent everywhere. Ruble the Snow Wolf did the same, and the two fellows immediately started fighting over territory the moment they boarded the spaceplane. They nearly broke into a fight. In the end, Huimao came out on top and seized more territory. Ruble was afraid that the cat would cheat him, so every time Huimao went out to patrol his territory, Ruble would go out and supervise him to prevent the cat from taking over his territory. As they were talking, Huimao walked in with his tail up, followed by Ruble, who had an ugly expression on his face. Yo, are you done patrolling? Armadillo greeted them. Ruble was annoyed at the mention of this. If this cat wasn't a team member's pet, I would have bitten it to death. Huimao jumped onto Sillin's shoulder and was licking his paws. When he heard Ruble's words, he raised his paw and pointed at Ruble. You know how many times I've eaten trash like you when I was a kid? Sillin smiled as he recalled the first time he met Huimao. This guy had indeed eaten a lot of wolves. He flicked Huimao's ear. Alright, don't argue. We're all teammates this time. Huimao snorted. We're both canines, but this guy is annoying no matter how I look at him. Chiefing is better. Ruble bared his teeth. If the cat said one more word, he would go over and bite off the cat's ear. Just as Huimao was about to say something, an alarm interrupted him. What's wrong? The sleepy Qi Lafong woke up with a start. Nothing, I just received a message. Nikki put down the game console and converted the received signal into characters. After decoding it, it was a message. If you want to find Black Viper, come here first, or you'll regret it. The people in the control room looked at the message in silence. Nikki continued to decode the message. Along with the message was a simple star map with a planet indicated on it. It wasn't the area that had disappeared, but a place slightly further away from that area. However, the similarity between all of them was that they hadn't forgotten about that planet. Even though everyone could find that planet on their star maps, no one paid attention to it. Moreover, there was very little information about that planet. In short, it could be summed up in one word: poor. After a while, Sillin asked White Knight, has our whereabouts been leaked? White Knight shook his head. No one knows where we're going except for the few of us. If it wasn't Black Viper, and no information had been leaked, then who had sent this encrypted message? There was no doubt that the person who had sent this message was very familiar with Sillin's group's whereabouts and goals. However, none of them could think of anyone who would do such a thing. What do we do? Are we going? Sadia looked at everyone. Same old rules, let's vote. Nikki moved her finger, and a screen appeared in front of everyone. There were 3 choices on it: go, no, and forfeit. The final choice was go. Looks like we all have the same idea. That's a good thing. Sadia smiled. Since they had decided to go, they adjusted their flight path and flew toward that planet. Everyone had been searching for information about that planet before they arrived, but the strange thing was that the results were all the same. However, the information was also quite limited, which made it even stranger. Even with their capabilities, they could only find so little information, and they weren't even sure if this information was real or not. Even the poorest planet, even if it's so barren that it can't support itself, the database should have records about it. However, there's just too little information. It's as if someone has erased all the other information, Nikki said. Her young face, which looked like she was 7 or 8 years old, was filled with a serious and contradictory expression. If Silan didn't already know that she was in her 30s, he would have thought that she had the same special experience as Tang Qiuqiu. No matter what, we need to be careful. Bring your equipment. While everyone was discussing a strategy, Rubu and Armadillo also joined in the discussion with serious expressions on their faces. Huima was the most relaxed in the control room. It didn't care about the strangeness of that planet at all. To it, this was just a hunting game. Not only was it not nervous, but it was also looking forward to it. It would be best if there was some fresh food to satisfy its hungry stomach. Silan and Blueskin had already divided up all the sea beast eggs they had collected, and now they were very hungry. Silan and the others found their destination planet based on the coordinates given by the message. The planet wasn't big, and the environment wasn't good. Although humans could survive on the planet, it definitely wasn't a good life. According to the scanning area of the probe, this was indeed a relatively barren planet. There weren't even any surveillance satellites or defense networks on the planet's periphery. It was obvious that the development of this planet wasn't good. What's the situation on the planet? Armadillo asked. Very poor. He was as poor as a doornail. Apart from the metal content in the city areas, the other places have pitifully little metal content. The soil is gray, and gray soil is lacking in many elements. There are very few plants that can survive in this kind of soil. There are less than 100 species of plants that have evolved to adapt to the soil, but each of them is very strong. It's survival of the fittest, Nikki explained. Looking at the planet from space, most of it was gray, and it looked very depressed and lifeless. From the image shown on the monitor, they could see what was happening on the bright side of the planet. The reason why almost all the metals on the planet were concentrated in the cities was that they were almost metal cities made of steel. Rather than calling them cities, it was better to call them large fortresses, as if they were guarding against something. Finally, they saw what the cities were guarding against. Not far from the cities, there were many black shadows moving very quickly. They were the animals that had adapted to the planet. They were about 3 meters tall, and had long claws that could dig through the gray soil to find small animals hiding underground. They could also use their sharp claws to attack humans. Humans were also part of their diet. There were many places on the planet that had these black monsters moving very quickly. Say, what do you think that mysterious person wants us to do here? Help clear out the monsters? Qi Lafeng said as he lay on the chair with his arms crossed, looking at the image on the screen. Bai didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Nikki and asked, "Is there anything else besides that message and the star map?" Nikki shook her head. "Nothing else. That's what I'm curious about." Just then, the receiver received another message, and Nikki quickly decoded it. "Welcome to this place." Sadia read out the decoded message and looked at Nikki in confusion. And then, "There's nothing else." Nikki was also very helpless. Was the other party messing with them with just this bit of information? Nikki rubbed her ears. She liked to rub her ears whenever she was annoyed. She continued, "Since that person has the technology to send us this message, the situation on this planet shouldn't be like this." Indeed, the backwardness of this planet is too far away from the technology that person possesses. Can't find the source of the message? Bai Yi asked Nikki. No. That person is very cunning. Almost every city on this planet has traces of his signal. So he's an expert. Is he really not from the Black Viper? Qi Lafeng said as he rubbed his chin. His eyes were so narrow that it was impossible to see the expression in them. They didn't say anything, and neither did they immediately land on the planet. Instead, they waited outside the planet. Sillin looked at Huimao on his shoulder. Even though the cat was trying its best to act as if nothing had happened, Sillin could tell from the frequency at which its whiskers were twitching and the curve of its tail that it was wagging. What was it proud of? There was only one answer. You know where the source is? Sillin pinched Huimao's ears. Huimao's ears twitched and flicked Sillin's hand away, but it didn't say anything. Did that mean it was tacit agreement? Everyone in the control room, and the animals looked at Huimao. This time, Huimao couldn't keep up his act any longer, and his mouth opened uncontrollably. How did it know? Rub was very reluctant to believe it. White Knight unfurled the scan map of the planet, and placed it in front of Huimao. You know where he is? Huimao raised a paw and pointed at one of the cities proudly. I only know that he's in this city, but I don't know which corner of the city he's in. But if he emits one more time, I'll be able to find him and catch this hidden rat. White Knight looked at Sillin, and Sillin nodded, indicating that he was trustworthy. Go to that city, White Knight said to Nikki. Okay. Nikki piloted the aircraft and flew in that direction. Rub's eyes widened. You believe it just like that? You believe this cat? There was a metal electric fence in the sky above the city to prevent dangerous birds from entering. There were also people who would keep an eye on them. From time to time, a few simple flying cars would fly out. These cars were very cumbersome, but they were very practical in this kind of environment. Although they weren't very agile, they had good defense and could withstand the attacks of some flying birds. There were also a few teams of people who drove armored land vehicles out to hunt. There was a lack of meat in the city. Man and beast, this was a two-way process of hunting. Both sides were on the other's menu. The people in the metal cities were generally stronger. Be it men or women, or even children, they all had a murderous look in their eyes. Different places nurtured different people. Their living environment shaped these people's personalities. Just like Tang Qiuqiu, these children had been armed with guns and knives since they were young. They learned how to fight against monsters from their elders, and it was a necessary lesson for them in life. Sillin's group didn't want to be too high profile. They didn't want to expose too much before they figured out the situation. However, every metal city was an independent entity, and they all rejected outsiders. In the end, they didn't go straight into the city. Instead, they found a place to settle down and figure out the situation on this planet. Otherwise, they would be caught like turtles in a jar if they recklessly entered the city. At night, the aircraft quietly landed at the predetermined location. The place was covered by a hill, and the aircraft landed in stealth mode, so no one noticed them. Although no one noticed them, the monsters were unusually perceptive. Those guys outside are pretty fast, Sadia said as he looked at the scene on the screen. I'm going to look for food. Huimao jumped off Sillin's shoulder and ran out. I'm going too. Rub didn't want to be left behind and ran out. I'm going out too. I'm hungry. Armadillo wagged his tail and followed. Chapter 272. Armadillo wasn't really hungry, but he was worried that the two of them would fight after they got out. If both of them got injured, it would be fine. After all, the two of them had strong regenerative abilities. The most important thing was that they couldn't expose themselves. They hadn't figured out who the person who sent the message was, and if there were any traps, so they couldn't be too reckless. The sky gradually brightened. On the hillside, the whole mountain looked gray. Some of the plants that grew on it had a depressing hue. There were also some white plants, but not many of them. Next to the gray forest, Rubu was tearing a clawed beast apart. It didn't have to do this, but Rubu was in a bad mood, so this prey that he just caught became his target to vent his anger. From the hillside, a few black dots could be seen moving on the ground in the distance, and these black dots were decreasing rapidly. Those black dots were the common black-clawed beasts on this planet, and the reason why they were decreasing was simple. A cat was eating them to fill its stomach. The gray cat and the gray land didn't look conspicuous at all. It was like a natural camouflage, so it didn't stand out from afar. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see what was happening without the help of tools, but Ruble and Armadillo weren't humans. Their vision was very good, and even without tools, they could see everything clearly without missing a single detail. It was a small cat, but when the black-clawed beasts pounced on it, its mouth suddenly widened and swallowed the black-clawed beasts. Then the second one, the third one. These clawed beasts were also intelligent. They knew that this inconspicuous animal was not easy to deal with, so they started to run away. Huimao chased after them, and with its speed, only a few clawed beasts could escape. No wonder Dar cried when he was bitten by that cat. If that cat really ate as much as it wanted, Dar's little crocodile would easily become its meal. But how big is that cat's stomach? Armadillo slowly crawled over and looked at Huimao and said to Rubu. Armadillo could tell from Huimao's movements that Huimao was quite strong. Not to mention its speed, just its hunting speed was something that Armadillo could not achieve. He didn't even need to bite the cat, and directly swallowed it. He wasn't like Bonner, the big snake. Besides, this cat was swallowed whole. If it were to be compared to the group of beasts in AF1, it would definitely be ranked among them. Rubu gnawed on the bones of the sharp-clawed beast and said impatiently, "Who knows? Aren't you afraid of bursting from eating so fast?" As soon as Rubu finished speaking, Huimao stopped chasing the clawed beasts. The remaining clawed beasts took this opportunity to escape. What happened to it? Armadillo saw that Huimao had suddenly stopped moving and was squatting in the distance, doing something unknown. Only his ears twitched from time to time, and his hooked tail wagged quite a bit, as if he had discovered something new. When Rubu heard Armadillo's words, he stopped chewing and looked at Huimao. Huimao maintained his squatting position for a while. Then he opened his mouth and spat out a black sharp-clawed beast that he had just swallowed. Armadillo and Rubu were speechless. Disgusting. Not long after the black claw beasts were swallowed, they went in alive. By the time they were spat out, a layer of them had been digested. Even the claws of the claw beasts had been dissolved, becoming shorter and softer. They were not as sharp as before. The sharp-clawed beast that was half-digested looked like a waste product. It was no longer as ferocious and murderous as before. "Does that cat have the habit of chewing itself?" Armadillo asked. Rubu turned its head away. Disgusting. Felines are indeed eccentric animals. It knew there were a few big cats in AF1 that liked to play with their prey until they were crippled before eating them. In comparison, the cat in front of it was even crazier. It was chewing itself. Because of Huimao's disgusting behavior, Rubu lost its appetite. It lifted its paw and kicked the remaining sharp-clawed beast into the woods. There were some small animals waiting to collect the leftovers. The remaining sharp-clawed beast was quickly surrounded by some small rodents that broke out from the ground. Not long after, not even its bones were left. "Hey, something is wrong with that cat. Is it food poisoning?" Armadillo wagged his tail and poked Rubu, who was lying on the ground with its eyes closed. Rubu immediately became energetic when he heard the word food poisoning. He had just eaten half of the sharp-clawed beast, so it should not be poisonous. It could even smell poisonous meat. Of course, there might be some special circumstances. A lizard and a wolf stared at Huimao. Huimao was jumping around the half-digested sharp-clawed beast. After jumping for a while, Huimao stretched out its paw. Its short paw grew longer, and it started to cut open the stomach of the sharp-clawed beast. Armadillo and Rubu were speechless. Why didn't they know that cats had such a weird habit? It was understandable if Huimao wanted to eat the internal organs, but the problem was that it was really dissecting the cat. Can you imagine a cat that was excited to find food spitting out the food it swallowed and dissecting it? What a scam! In fact, Rubu and Armadillo couldn't feel Huimao's current mood. Huimao was very excited at the moment, because it keenly discovered something fun. It hadn't played with this thing for a long time, and Silen also hadn't played with it for a long time. When it was digesting the sharp-clawed beast, Huimao discovered that there was another kind of animal living in the sharp-clawed beast's body. If it was right, it was the parasite that Silen mentioned. Every time he found a new parasite with great potential, Silen would always make something to play with. Compared to those big guys, Huimao preferred to play with these small things. It used its claws to cut open the half-digested skin of the sharp-clawed beast, and then cut open its stomach. There was a worm in the stomach that looked like a small scorpion, and it was only the size of an adult's thumb. It clung tightly to the wall of the sharp-clawed beast's stomach, and the stomach wall of the sharp-clawed beast was much thinner. The worms attached to the sharp-clawed beast's stomach wall would steal the energy of the food, and a part of the food that the sharp-clawed beast swallowed would be digested by these worms. When the sharp-clawed beast's stomach was cut open, the worms realized that they were in danger and wanted to escape. They used their claws to tear open the already thin stomach wall and tried to escape. However, their speed was still not as fast as Huimao. Huimao stretched out its claws and pulled the worms back, then ran and pulled them back. On the hillside, Ruble and Amadiro were stunned by what they saw. "What is that thing?" Ruble asked. "I don't know. It seems to be from the sharp-clawed beast's stomach." "Rubu, did you eat the sharp-clawed beast's stomach?" Armadillo asked worriedly. Before it knew what was going on, it wasn't sure if the worms would affect them or not. Armadillo shivered when he thought of the worms in their stomach, and the scales on his body stood up. "No, I was disgusted by that thing before I had the chance to eat it." Rubu was glad that it didn't continue to chew on the sharp-clawed beast, otherwise it might have eaten the whole thing. Rubu and Armadillo didn't pay attention to this when they ate before, but after witnessing Weeze's actions today, they were probably going to be traumatized for a long time to come. They had to make sure that there were no strange insects in their meat before they ate. "Huh." Armadillo raised its tail and swung Rubu, who was trying to check its stomach, and pointed in a direction with its chin. Rubu looked in the direction that Armadillo pointed. About 300 meters away from where Huimao was, there was a human teenager hiding behind a few big rocks. Judging from the teenager's attire, he should be a hunter from the city. He had a gun and a crossbow in his hand, and he was carefully hiding behind the rocks, staring at Huimao's direction. He looked very nervous, but he tried to stay calm. All in all, he was a pretty good hunter. "Should we remind the cat?" Armadillo asked. "Remind it what?" Ruba didn't care. "Remind it not to eat people randomly." Ruba was speechless. This was indeed a problem. As usual, Dan too joined the hunting team in the morning to hunt croc beasts. However, he saw an injured croc beast on the way, and he didn't want to give it up. After all, a croc beast could be exchanged for more resources, and it was much better than those small croc beasts. Moreover, this croc beast was injured. Dan too thought this was a good opportunity, so he informed the team leader. The team leader gave him 30 minutes, and if he couldn't come back within 30 minutes, they would not wait for him. A lone hunter would most likely be eaten by the croc beasts, no matter how strong the hunter was. After all, the area outside the city was the croc beast's territory. When the communicator was switched on, the magnetic field would be very strong, and the croc beasts were very sensitive to magnetic fields. Therefore, all the hunters who came out to hunt would turn off their communicators, or they would be attacked by the croc beasts that followed the scent of blood. Dan too had learned a lot of skills from the experienced croc beasts since he was a child. He joined the hunting team when he was 10, and now he could be considered an experienced hunter. He knew how to hide and track. Dan too carefully chased after the injured croc beast, thinking about the best time to make his move. He couldn't afford to run into other croc beasts, or it would be difficult for Dan too alone. Finally, Dan too found an opportunity. However, just as he was about to make his move, the injured croc beast suddenly screamed and ran in another direction anxiously. Was he exposed? Dan too was about to continue chasing, but he suddenly sensed something coming, so he hid again. Not long after, two croc beasts ran past them, as if something terrifying was chasing them. This should be the reason why the injured croc beast was so anxious. Dan too looked in the direction the two croc beasts had come from. Just what was it that could make the two croc beasts so afraid? What did the croc beasts see? The croc beasts had always claimed to be the overlords of this gray land. The injured croc beast would not be able to catch up with them in such a short time. And there were only 15 minutes left. Go back. Dan too was reluctant. His mind was filled with questions. In the end, driven by curiosity, Dan too carefully sneaked in the direction the croc beast came from. Not long after, he saw a flat ground at the foot of a mountain. There was a cat squatting on the ground. There were no cats on this planet. He had only seen them in books, magazines, and on TV in the city. Those who hadn't read magazines or TV would not know that there was such an animal called a cat. Why was there a cat here? But what surprised Dan2 even more was that, according to the book, a cat's attack power wasn't strong, but this small cat was standing in front of an unknown thing. Dan2 studied it carefully for a long time before he realized that it was a croc beast. If it weren't for his understanding of the croc beast, he wouldn't have been able to recognize the croc beast that had been severely corroded. How did the croc beast become like this? Why was the cat squatting beside it in a daze? However, what happened next shocked Dan2's day. The cat's claws could instantly grow so long that it easily cut open the croc beast's skin and dissected it. When he saw the insects, Dan2's face turned pale, just like the first time he killed a croc beast. Fear. Dan2 was now quite afraid. He regretted coming here out of curiosity. Wasn't this just courting death? Everything on TV and in books was fucking fake. How could a cat be a weak animal? Would a weak animal dissect a croc beast so easily? He was now absolutely sure that the croc beasts were afraid of this cat. This cat was not even as long as his forearm. He tried to calm his racing heart and think of a plan. He couldn't turn on the communicator. If he did, he would be discovered. He couldn't call for help, and no one would come to save him. It was best to retreat quietly. As soon as he turned his head, a voice came from beside him. "Yo kid, where do you think you're going?" Dan2 was startled. He reflexively prepared to shoot, but before he could do so, his vision went black and he lost consciousness. Huimao sniffed Dan2's body and looked at the gun and crossbow on Dan2 with disgust. It was as Sillin had said, this place was really poor and backward. However, the young man's physique was quite good. He could be used to test the insects. There were only 3 insects left in the claw beast's stomach. Originally, he wanted to knock them out, but he didn't control his strength well, and killed a few of them. A few of them were severely injured, and he didn't know if they could recover. However, it didn't matter if they couldn't recover. He could just catch a few more to see. Although not all claw beasts had these insects in their bodies, he would find them eventually. The gray cat didn't have anything to store the 3 fainted insects and the severely crippled insects. It just so happened that it found a hard leather bag on Dan2's body. It was a bag made from the skin of a claw beast that had been processed, so it should be able to store the insects temporarily. Armadillo and Ruble were walking over. They didn't want to let the cat eat people, and they wanted to bring the man back for interrogation. However, when they got close, they bumped into the bag that Huimao threw at them. "Hey, you two, come and help me with this." Huimao pointed at the bag that contained the insects and said. Armadillo and Ruble avoided the bag as if it was the plague. "You can take your own things. We can just drag this man back," Ruble said. "No, this is my experiment." After that, Wheeze ignored Armadillo and Rubu and tied the bag to Dan2's body. Then, it used the rope it found from Dan2's body to reinforce the bag a couple of times before dragging Dan2 back to the spaceplane by the collar. It wasn't exactly dragging Dan2 all the way back to the spaceplane, but Wheeze wasn't dragging him all the way back to the spaceplane. Armadillo and Ruble looked at each other, shook their heads, and followed closely. They didn't know what the cat would do when it returned. Experiment? What experiment? Put the insects into that man's body? Disgusting. On the aircraft, Nikki had already hacked into the city's network to get some basic information. The city's network was not well developed, and it could be said to be simple and crude. All the appliances looked like antiques to them. Sillin and the others were analyzing the information they had gathered, but they couldn't find the rat that Huimao mentioned. Where was the mysterious man hiding in this city? Just as they were discussing whether they should grab a local and interrogate them, the display showed the scene of the gray cat dragging a person into the spaceplane. Bai Yi and the others looked at Sillin at the same time. Sillin shrugged. "I didn't order him to do that." Sadia gave Sillin a thumbs up. "You've trained your pet well." Sillin curled his lips. There was no way that the cat dragging the man into the aircraft was the reason that they thought it was. As expected, after understanding the situation, they were very interested in the insects that Huimao mentioned. But they couldn't look at it here, so they went to the quarantine room. After putting down the partition, Bai Yi and the others didn't enter the quarantine room under Armadillo and Ruble's persuasion. Instead, they stood on the other side of the partition and looked at the scene inside. Sillin had worked with Huimao many times. He first used a device to simulate the environment of a stomach. The 3 parasites that had recovered, and the ones that were severely injured by Huimao were very excited when they entered the environment. They attached themselves to the edge of the wall and stabilized their bodies. The edge of the wall where they attached themselves became much thinner, and they began to absorb the nutrients in the internal environment. The severely injured parasites gradually recovered, and their severed limbs began to grow back. How is it? Not bad, right? Huimao said proudly. Not bad. Sillin locked the parasites in a small box that simulated the environment of a stomach. But it's not very practical right now. We're going up against robots, and robots don't have stomachs. Huimao's ears twitched, and he wasn't too happy about it. But you did a good job this time. You deserve to be praised. Sillin rubbed Huimao's head. That's more like it. Huimao narrowed his eyes, thinking about when he should catch a few more claw beasts to see if there were any other insects. It was boring to stay here anyway. After studying the insects, everyone shifted their attention to the person that Huimao dragged back. He looked like a 14 or 15-year-old boy, but judging from his physique, outfit, and the equipment he carried, this boy was also a tough character. When Dan Tu woke up, the first thing he felt when he opened his eyes was an unfamiliar environment. It wasn't the gray land, nor was it any city. It was so strange that it felt like he had come to another world. The next moment, Dan Tu's attention was focused on Huimao, who was squatting on the shoulder of a stranger. It was this cat that caused him to end up like this. Dan Tu didn't panic when he saw the strangers, unlike when he saw Huimao. After all, he felt safer facing a human than a beast that he couldn't understand at all. Moreover, Dan Tu didn't sense any ill will from these strangers. Of course, it could just be a facade. Huimao squatted on Sillin's shoulder and licked its paw. This action alone made the boy, who had just woken up, tremble and shrink back. Sillin flicked Huimao's ear. What did you do to him? The boy was scared out of his wits. Sadia looked at Huimao, then at Armadillo and Ruble, and sighed. These 2 ferocious-looking fellows couldn't even compare to a little kitten. Seeing that the boy was full of wariness, Nikki went straight into action. After all, a little girl who looked like she was only 7 or 8 years old was easier to get close to. Don't be afraid. As long as you don't move, we won't hurt you. We just want to ask you some questions, Nikki said. Dan Tu didn't say anything as he stared at the little girl in front of him who gave off a strange vibe. Nikki asked a few more questions, but Dan Tu still didn't say anything. His entire body was on high alert. Chi Lafeng pointed at his mouth. Language barrier? Nikki slapped her forehead. How could she have forgotten? The people here didn't speak the Empire's common tongue. The native language was too small, and the Empire didn't have any records of it. However, when Huimao and the others went out to hunt, Nikki had already gathered enough information about the language from various cities on the planet. After setting up the translation machine, she directly translated the language into Dan Tu's. So, after Nikki turned on the machine, she asked the same question again. Finally, Dan Tu spoke, his voice a little hoarse. What do you want to ask? Sillin handed him a glass of fruit juice. Fruit juice. It's not poisonous. Dan Tu hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Huimao on Sillin's shoulder. Seeing that the dog was lazily licking its paw and wasn't paying attention to them, he carefully took the glass of fruit juice from Sillin, took a small sip, paused, and then poured the entire contents into his mouth. After finishing, he licked the glass, as if he hadn't had enough. Sillin handed him another glass. This time, Dan Tu didn't hesitate and drank it in large gulps. Dan Tu had never tasted something like this before. It was delicious, much better than the most expensive drink in the city. He wanted to bring this back for Grandpa'n to drink. Grandpa'n was so old that he probably hadn't tasted this much fruit juice. However, he couldn't even protect himself right now. He didn't even know if he could go back and see Grandpa'n again. Dan Tu didn't lower his guard much after drinking the fruit juice, but his voice was no longer hoarse. He seemed to have calmed down as well. This was a good sign. After calming down, Dan too answered all of Nikki's basic questions. He told Sillin and the others his name, as well as the black-clawed beast that Huimao had eaten was called a croc beast. In the local language it meant sharp claws. However, the croc beast was a general term for all kinds of black beasts with sharp claws. Very few of them were of a single species, and most of them were born in clusters. However, there were a few special breeds among the croc beasts. One of them was called Galas, a fierce beast that was several times larger than ordinary croc beasts. Its attack power was much stronger, but they were relatively few in number. Nikki asked Dan too if he had any way to bring them into the city. Dan too shook his head. Apart from the guards and hunting squads, no one else is allowed to enter or leave the city without the permission of the city lord. City lord? What rank is that? Nikki asked. Although they had learned some information through the city's communication network, it was still limited. The network here was too backward, and people rarely communicated with each other through the network. This was the system of social relations in a special technological environment. The city lord is the highest-ranking official in our city. Dan too paused for a moment before asking. You're not from this planet, are you? Nikki didn't deny it. The answer was obvious, so there was no need to deny it. Yes, we're from this planet. Then it's even more impossible for us to let you into the city. We're very repulsed by aliens, especially the city lord. There was once an alien who entered our planet due to a malfunctioning spaceship and never returned. Although that didn't happen in our city, I've heard people say that something similar happened in our city before. Are you threatening us? Nikki sneered. No, just a reminder. Dan too lowered his head and didn't say anything else. No one could tell what he was thinking. At this moment, Huimao spoke up. I think this kid isn't telling the truth. Why don't we try using that bug? Rubu and Armadillo, who were standing behind them, thought at the same time. Cats really are evil creatures. Hearing Huimao's words, Dan too suddenly raised his head. A flash of fear flashed across his eyes, and he reached for his gun and hunting knife out of habit. Only when he touched empty air did he remember that everything on him had been confiscated. Fight. Although he wasn't tied up, Dan too knew that he was no match for them. Not to mention that he had this cat with him. Sillin flicked Huimao. Don't scare a kid. Huimao snorted twice. It was just a scare, it was too boring. Nikki asked a few more questions, but she didn't get the answers she wanted. It was impossible to let Dan too go, so they could only lock him up here for now. If there was any new information, they could ask him for reference. They arranged a small room for Dan Tuesday. Although the room looked simple to Sillin and the others, it was an unimaginable luxury for Dan Tuesday. There was also juice and other food that he hadn't eaten yet. Although he didn't have to worry about food, Dan too's nerves were challenged. If this continued for a few days, he would probably have a nervous breakdown. That was because the cat would come here every now and then. It didn't say anything and just crouched there, licking its paws. Whenever Dan too saw the cat's paws, he would think of the croc's belly being cut open. Huimao, on the other hand, was delighted. There were actually people who were afraid of cats. Chapter 273. When dusk approached, Dan too was brought to the control room once more. When he saw Sillin and the others again, Dan too was no longer as fearful and surprised as before. Other than looking at Huimao a little cautiously, he was much calmer than before. It had to be said that this young man's mental fortitude was quite good. Perhaps it was due to the environment he lived in, but he was much calmer and more mature than his peers from other peaceful planets. However, Dan too's calmness crumbled when he saw the projection in the center of the control room. There was a table in the center of the control room, and on it was a projection of the entire city that Nikki had sent out when a patrol team was returning to the city. After entering the city, the miniature detector split into several smaller parts and scanned the entire metal city from different directions. After scanning, the information would be transmitted to the flying craft to form a comprehensive map. The metal city's outdated defense system would not be able to detect any external detectors sneaking in and transmitting information to the outside world. Even after living in this city for more than 10 years, Dan Tu had never seen the entirety of it. But now he was seeing it in front of an alien. Even if the city's landmarks were shrunk several times, Dan Tu would still be able to recognize them at a glance. Dan Tu was afraid that Silen and the others would really harm the people in the city. The difference in technology between the two sides was too great. If a battle were to break out, even if they won in the end, they would have to pay a heavy price. Those who would become cannon fodder would definitely be the isolated people living at the bottom of society. Like Dan Tu and the lonely old man next door, Grandpa and Nikki saw Dan Tu's reaction and smiled. "We're not that interested in this city. We just want to find someone in it. This person is hiding in your city, and he has the same technology as us. He was the one who told us to come. Otherwise, we wouldn't have paid attention to a poor little planet in a corner of the empire." Dan too relaxed a little when he heard Nikki's words, but he was also very curious about the person Nikki was talking about. Just what kind of person would hide in their city and do something like this? At the same time, Dan too also had some understanding of Nikki's goal. "I don't know the person you're talking about, and I've never heard of anyone in the city with high-level technology," Dan too said. "I don't expect you to know," Nikki pointed at the projection on the table. "We'll look for him ourselves, but I hope you can help us with something." "What is it?" "We need to borrow your place." Nikki stopped the rotating projection and moved it in front of Dan Tuesday. Dan too pursed his lips. After a moment of silence, he looked at the people around him. "Will you hurt the people in the city?" Sadia chuckled when he heard that. "We're not begging you, kid. We can find another solution even without your help, but that might hurt other people in the city. You don't want your compatriots to be hurt, do you? Hurry up, we don't have that much patience. There's a cunning fox in the city waiting for us to catch it." "We Shan Tutu, and we is." Qi Lafeng purposely emphasized on killing the innocent. If the people they ran into weren't innocent, then they couldn't be blamed. They had no choice but to be cautious when it came to Black Viper, or else they would be the ones to die. Dan too hesitated for a moment before walking forward and pointing at his place on the projection. It was a poor area of the city, and most of the residents were widows and widows. Dan too lived in a 6-story metal building. The area of each house was very small. The largest was only about 30 square meters. Dan too's living area was only about 10 square meters. It was not even 1/3 of the size of their control room. Rent was a big problem. Dan too and the others could only afford the rent there. Buildings of higher quality, sturdier, and better security would cost them an astronomical sum. Dan too told them the exact location of his place, and the surveillance device hidden in the city quietly flew in that direction. It didn't take long for it to arrive at the building Dan too had mentioned, and the situation of the entire building was clearly displayed. The neighbor to the left of Dan too's place was drying dried meat and talking to a few other people standing in the hallway. Their conversation could be heard clearly. As for the neighbor on the right side of Dan too's house, the door was closed, and Silen didn't know what kind of person he was. However, he could tell from Dan too's eyes that the person who lived there was very important to him. Dan too didn't seem to care about the other people who appeared in the image, but the moment the image was displayed, the first thing Dan too looked at wasn't his house, but the neighbor's house on the right. Fortunately, there weren't many patrols there. Since it was a poor area, patrols didn't often appear there. Most of them were around the high-class residential areas to ensure the safety of the people living there and prevent flying beasts from attacking them. Nikki stopped asking Dan 2 questions after she was done with her investigation. Instead, she watched as Qi Lafeng and Sadia studied the so-called high-class residential areas in the city. They would have to wait until the sky was completely dark before they moved out. Because of the environment, most people in the city wouldn't go out at night. Only the patrols would roam the city. No one paid attention to Dan too, but he didn't run away either. It was because he knew that he had no chance of escaping from these people. Whoosh! A flying car model flew into the room, and there was a cat standing on top of it. The cat was holding a box in its mouth. Dan too wanted to dodge out of reflex when he saw Huimao, but he was attracted by the flying car model again. The difference in technology made Dan too very curious about flying objects like this. Huimao flew the flying car model to Silen and put down the box. Assemble this too, Silen. Inside the box was one of Silen's prizes from the flying car race. It was one of the two flying car models Flika had made based on veg fritter, and the other one was in Naimi's possession. Although it couldn't have veg fritter's complicated and diverse internal structure, it was still quite extravagant for a toy model. A small toy model like this was enough to buy a flying car that was about the same size. Of course, luxurious flying cars and racing cars were an exception. There was still some time before the operation anyway, so Silen took the box, sat down and started assembling the flying car model. Huimao lay on top of the flying car model and watched it with his tail wagging. From time to time, he would shoot a smug glance at Ruble and Armadillo who were lying on the other side of the control room. Ruble and Armadillo were so angry that they gritted their teeth and thought, "So what if you have a toy?" Dantu was very curious about the flying car model. It was probably the flying car they were talking about on TV. It looked a little different, but they were all similar. He didn't expect to see such a small toy. Dantu wanted to get closer to see Silen's assembly, but he was very wary of Huimao. After pacing back and forth for a while, his curiosity won over his fear, and he inched closer to Huimao. Huimao only glanced at him once, and then ignored him. Dantu let out a sigh of relief. Silen's assembly speed wasn't fast, but it was rhythmic and practiced. Every part was assembled precisely. Dantu grew more and more fascinated by the round, pancake-shaped object that was slowly taking shape in Silen's hands. It felt like a whirlpool was sucking all of his attention into it, and he was more than happy to be sucked into it himself. "Do you have your own flying car?" Silen asked. His voice was low and slow. Dantu shook his head as he stared at the model in Silen's hands that was slowly taking shape. "I'm assembling a flying car model right now. This kind of flying car was despised by people for a long time, but after a race, everyone changed their opinion of it." Silen explained a few things while he was assembling the model. Then he asked, "What would you do if you had your own flying car?" Dantu looked very puzzled. Then he started thinking, "I would fly Grandpa around the city and show him how the city is doing. The city has doubled in size, and a lot of new places have been built." "Grandpa? Yes. Without Grandpa, I wouldn't have lived until now." Dantu's mother had passed away a long time ago, and his father had gone out to hunt when he was 7 and never returned. Less than a fifth of the hunting party had made it back to the city alive, because they had encountered a Gala's beast, one of the strongest of the sharp-clawed beasts. Dantu had no ability to hunt alone, and the people around him did not help him, because there were too many such examples in the city, so many that everyone was numb. When Dantu was about to starve to death, he rarely went out, and Grandpa, who was not familiar with everyone, gave him food. Grandpa's savings were left behind by his children, but after they passed away, the old man seemed to have become a lot quieter and rarely left the house. Because of his disability, he was always in a wheelchair with no one to take care of him. Everyone in the control room listened to Dantu's words. Chi Lafeng and Sadia exchanged a glance. If their guess was correct, Silen had hypnotized Dantu. Why else would the vigilant little guy talk so much? Dantu's expression softened a lot when he talked about what happened after he met Grandpa. But when he mentioned that Silen and the others wanted to borrow Dantu's house in the city, Dantu's face contorted as if he was resisting something. Big beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, and Dantu abruptly raised his head to glare at Silen. The fury and madness in his eyes made Silen feel like the little guy was going to swing a knife at him the next moment. "What did you do to me?" Dantu huffed and puffed. His fingers curled into fists, but they were shaking uncontrollably. He had said too much just now, and he was bound to slip up. Silen smiled and assembled the last part. Then he passed it to Huimao and told it to play on the side. "Your willpower is not bad," Celine commented. You can't hurt Grandpa, you can't?" Dantu roared at Silen. "I didn't say I was going to hurt him." Silen stood up and patted his thighs. Then, he walked out of the control room, but stopped after taking 2 steps. He turned around and said to Dantu, "You smiled when you were telling me about your relationship with that Grandpa, and someone once told me that blinking when you smile means that you are truly thinking of something that makes you happy." Dantu loosened his clenched fists, then clenched them again. Indeed, there was a time when Dan too felt very happy. Although he was already an orphan at that time, he had Grandpa by his side. He was the old man who always sat in a wheelchair and told Dan too stories that he had never heard before. He taught him how to hunt and how to protect himself. Dan too's wish was that one day, he could hunt enough things to exchange for enough currency in the city. Then he could pick up Grandpa from next door and live in a sturdier and more spacious building like a fortress, and live a better life. Before it was completely dark, the last hunting team that left the city returned to the city. It was the hunting team that Dan too was in. The hunting team did not see Dan too within the allotted time, and Dan too's communicator could not be contacted. So according to past experience, Dan too had either met with an accident, or he was lost somewhere. Either way, it was the same result, because in both cases, the chance of surviving alone was close to zero. Moreover, Dan too was only a 15-year-old boy. Even though he had nearly 5 years of hunting experience, he was still lacking in many aspects. He could not compare to the experienced hunters. When they were about to return to the city, they still could not contact Dan Tuesday. Finally, the hunting team gave up and returned to the city with the results of today's hunt. However, when the hunting team entered the city gate, no one noticed that there was a person hiding in the pile of croc beast corpses. There was a small protrusion in an inconspicuous place on the armored vehicle. Very good. Sillin has successfully entered. Inside the aircraft, Nikki said as she looked at the image sent back by the transmitter on Sillin's body. Behind Nikki, Rubu and Armadillo were both in the control room. They did not go out like the others. Dan too sat quietly to the side, nervously watching the extraterrestrials' movements. Not far from the city, Sadia and Chi Lafeng were lying in ambush. Only Sillin and Bai Yi had entered the city. Bai Yi and Sillin's group had entered the city. Bai Ye's target was the mayor's residence, while Sillin went to Dan too's residence first. Everyone split up. The equipment in the city was much less advanced, so they could not detect Bai Yi and Sillin at all. As for Huimao, they could not detect him at all. After Sillin entered the city, he found an opportunity to leave the hunting team and hide in a secluded place, waiting for night to fall. When the sky was completely dark and everyone was hiding in their houses, Sillin snuck towards Dan too's residence. Most of the hunters in the city were experienced hunters, and they were very sensitive to danger and changes in their surroundings. There were many things that could not be faked with technology. That was why both Sillin and Bai Yi were very cautious in the city. The layout of the entire city was deeply imprinted in Sillin's mind, so it did not take long for Sillin to arrive at the building where Dan too lived. With Celine's hearing, he could hear a few families talking about the Dantu. Today, the hunting team had brought news that Dan too had not returned to the city. In the eyes of these people, Dan too was definitely not coming back. However, from their tone, it was obvious that these people only treated the Dan too as a topic to kill time after a meal. They did not feel much sympathy or regret for him. Because they were numb, they were indifferent. The relationships between people here were just like the city, filled with the cold light of metal. In this special environment, no one would criticize others for being right or wrong. Here the living were always right. Sillin arrived at the floor of Dan too's residence. There was no one outside the building now. There were always unknown dangers lurking in the dark, and it was the safest place for the people here to hide in their homes at night. When he passed by Grandpa An's house that Dan too had mentioned, Sillin paused for a moment and shot a glance at the house whose door was tightly shut and completely devoid of light. It was only then that he stood in front of Dan too's house, took out the key that Dan too had given him, and opened the door. However, the moment he opened the door, Sillin sensed that there was someone inside the house. Inside the aircraft, the image on the screen in front of Nikki began to stutter, and then completely cut off. The received signal had been jammed. Electromagnetic interference. How could there be electromagnetic interference at such a high level? That person was there. This was the first thing that came to Nikki's mind. She quickly contacted Bai Yi and Chi Lafeng and Sadia, who were outside the city. Sillin went on high alert the moment he sensed that there was someone inside the house. He dodged the incoming wind and blocked the opponent's punches and kicks. Then he leaned to the side and used the ground to bounce off the ground. His other hand unsheathed a long sword and pointed it at the opponent. The image that Sillin sent to the aircraft was only cut off for a moment. Huimao's interference was removed, and the image was restored. There was no light in the house, but Sillin could clearly see the person in front of him through the faint light that seeped in from the outside. The aircraft could also clearly see the person standing in front of Sillin through the night vision filter. After seeing this person, the person who reacted the most was not Nikki and the others, but Dan Tuesday. Dan Tu rose from his chair in agitation. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Impossible. How could it be her? Didn't she already? That woman looks a little familiar, Qi Lafeng, who was somewhere outside the city, said after seeing the image that Nikki sent them. Nikki shook her head. I don't remember. I saw her not too long ago. Although we didn't talk, I remember that she was one of the people who participated in the same race as that kid, Sillin. Sadia said as he watched the image. Dan Tu's house. The person in front of Sillin didn't continue to attack. In fact, she didn't show any killing intent just now. It was precisely because of this that Sillin didn't kill her. Otherwise he would have slashed her down a long time ago. Sillin pointed the tip of his blade at the person in front of him. Truth be told, he didn't expect to see this person here. We meet again, Chiu Su. Chapter 274. Chiu Su wasn't nervous about being pointed at by Sillin's blade. On the contrary, Chiu Su was very calm, as if everything was within her expectations. The lights in the room weren't turned on, and the door wasn't closed. Huimao walked in from outside, glanced at the two people in the room, and then paid them no more attention. He believed that Sillin could handle this. Dan Tu's residence was indeed very small, and the decorations were also very simple. Huimao walked around the room, and then looked at a wall. Behind this wall was another house. The grandpa that Dan Tu had mentioned lived there. However, Huimao jumped up, and with a hook of his claws he dug out a small device. This device could not only monitor everything in the room, but it could also be used as an alarm and initial defense. However, this defense system had already been turned off when Chiu Su arrived. Otherwise, Sillin wouldn't have been able to enter with just a key, and he would also be electrocuted by the device as an enemy attack. Apart from this device, there was also a device next to the lights on the ceiling that looked similar to a light, but it was actually an intelligent laser emitter. Next, Huimao dug out a few other devices. These devices were mainly used for defense, and their main purpose was to protect the owner of the house, which was to protect Dan Tuesday. The level of technology used in these devices didn't match the development of this planet at all. Dan Tu, who was in the spaceplane, was dumbfounded. He didn't recognize these devices, and even after living here for so many years, he didn't know that there were so many unexpected things in such a small, rundown house. If Nikki hadn't explained the functions of these devices to him, even if Dan Tu saw them, he wouldn't have known what they were for, and might even have thrown them away like garbage. Chiu Su didn't say anything, and she didn't show any dissatisfaction with Huimao's behavior. Instead, she looked out the door. Not long after, a shadow appeared outside. It was Bai Yi. After receiving Nikki's notice, Bai Yi immediately rushed over from the city lord's residence. After all, the purpose of their trip was to find the person who sent the message, not to study the city lord. Seeing Bai Yi flash in, Chiu Su said to Bai Yi and Sillin, "Since the two of you are here, come with me." Chiu Su ignored the knife pointed at her, and walked out of the door. Sillin sheathed his sword and gestured to Bai Yi. Then the two of them followed Chiu Su out. Although they were confused, it was necessary to be vigilant. As for Huimao, that guy just dug a hole, and went next door. Just as Huimao and Sillin had thought. Chiu Su's destination was the house next door, which was Grandpa An's house that Dan Tu had mentioned. When Sillin passed by the shop, he could feel the mechanical activity inside. It was a machine that surpassed the average level of technology in this place. Places with machines would have a special mechanical language for communication. This was the advantage that Sillin and Huimao had over others. Since Huimao had suppressed the electromagnetic interference, the situation here could be seen from the aircraft. Dan Tu was the most agitated one. He hoped that things weren't as he thought, but as Sillin and the others entered the room next door, Dan2's heart sank. Everything was fake. The house wasn't big, but compared to Dan2's, it was a little more spacious. As soon as he entered, Sillin saw an old man in a wheelchair. The old man was holding a paper book in his hand. The solar lamp on the table next to him was dim, but for Sillin and Bai Yi, it was enough for them to see everything in the house clearly. Huimao dug a hole next door and shook his hair. His enlarged pupils swept around the house, and then he jumped onto Sillin's shoulder. After Chiyosu brought them in, she closed the door and stood behind the old man. Although the old solar lamp wasn't very bright, the processed image sent back to the aircraft was clear enough. Dan2 looked at Chiyosu on the image, his eyes full of doubt. "You know her?" Nikki asked. Dan2 nodded, then shook his head. "At first glance she looks like her, but now that I look closer, there are some differences." "Who does she look like?" Nikki asked. "Grandpa An's daughter." Dan2 had seen that woman when he was young. He heard from his father that she was a very powerful female warrior, but after a hunt, she never came back. Everyone said that she was dead. And this girl on the screen, who looked about the same age as him, what was her relationship with Grandpa An? Why did she look so much like that woman? Inside the house, the old man in the wheelchair closed the book, looked up at Sillin and Bai Yi, then looked at the cat on Sillin's shoulder, looking around and smiled. "You're finally here." As he spoke, the old man stood up from the wheelchair, walked 2 steps to the bookshelf, and placed the book on it. How is this possible? Isn't Grandpa An? Dan2's mind was a mess. This old man in the wheelchair wasn't a cripple. Nikki sneered. "Who said that people in wheelchairs are cripples?" "Yes, who said that people in wheelchairs must be cripples?" Dan2 remembered that Grandpa An had always worn a long robe all these years, completely covering his feet, not letting anyone touch his legs. Even Dan2 had always thought that it was because of Grandpa An's pride, but now he knew that the truth was not what people thought it was. Who was Grandpa An? How long had he been hiding in the city? Dan2 didn't know that Grandpa An had been like this for as long as he could remember. Perhaps no one in the entire building would have thought that such a lonely old man turned out to be an alien. Moreover, the so-called lonely and helpless pitiful people were also fake. What people saw and thought was the impression that the old man wanted to create, and everything was under the old man's control. After putting the book down, the old man walked back to the wheelchair and sat down. He looked in Sillin's direction, and his eyes were focused on the signal transmitter that Sillin was carrying. "Dan2, you're over there, right?" "Hee Dan2, don't worry, they won't hurt you." After saying that, the old man looked at Sillin. "The signal has been cut, right? Some things are not good for others to hear." "Okay." Sillin disconnected the signal transmitter, and Huimao on his shoulder cooperated and stopped blocking the electromagnetic interference signal. That way, no one outside would know what happened inside the room. Bai Yi also turned off the signal transmitter and quietly waited for the old man to continue. The old man was very satisfied with Sillin and Bai Yi's decisiveness in turning off the signal transmitter. "The unknown messages that you received were sent by me. I mean no harm. I just want to remind you that if you go to Black Viper's place like this, you will suffer a great loss." The old man's voice was calm, and there was no emotion in it. It was like he was stating something that did not matter. "Who are you?" Bai Yi asked. Bai Yi had been in AF1 for many years, and he knew a lot of the more secretive information, but he did not know anything about this old man. Based on instinct, he felt that the old man before him was not as simple as he appeared. He was like a reclusive expert, sitting in the corner with a book in his hand, quietly observing the changes in the empire. "Who am I?" The old man chuckled softly. "Even if I told you, you would not have heard of me. However, if I did not say it, you would not believe what I am about to say." The old man's white hair was not messy, and the 2 strands of hair on the sides covered half of his eyes, making it impossible to see what he was thinking. "Do you know who the leader of Black Viper is?" the old man asked. Sillin frowned, but did not say anything. His knowledge was limited, and he only knew that the current leader of Black Viper had inherited the position of the previous leader. The son took over his father's position, and their surname was the same, Christie. If anyone said Black Viper's Christie, they must be referring to the current leader of Black Viper. Bai Yi was silent for a moment, and then answered, Feng Onlang, Christie Onlang Feng. Onlang Feng, yes, Christie Onlang Feng. The old man repeated in a low voice, and then looked at Silin and Bai Yi. Everyone thinks that Onlang Feng is a person's name, but that is not the case. Onlang Feng is the name of 3 people. Silin's eyelids twitched. He had a bad feeling about this. The old man looked straight at Silin and Bai Yi. My name is Gu Chang'an. Gu Chang'an, there was an N in his name. The person working for Black Viper right now is Christie Onlang. As for Feng, you all know him. Silin sighed inwardly. As expected. Guan Feng Gu Chang'an, Christie Onlang. Feng Onlang, the leader of Black Viper. No one would have thought that there were 3 leaders of Black Viper, right? What on earth was Guan Feng trying to do? The old man waved his hand, and a floating projector flew over. The image of a planet was displayed on top of it. Qiu Su turned off the light. The image was enlarged, and Silin and Bai Yi could see the general situation of the planet. The terrain, the environment, the layout. This is the planet you're going to, the old man said. This isn't Black Viper's headquarters, Silin said with certainty. This isn't, but it is the place you're going to. If Guan Feng is also one of Black Viper's leaders, why do we need to find him? Silin asked. Because the 2 of you are the people Guan Feng recommended. Recommended what? Gu Chang'an didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that surprised both Silin and Bai Yi. It's time for Black Viper to be replaced. Replaced? Replaced what? Black Viper was the Empire's biggest dark power. Why would they need to replace them? Hee, you'll have to find the answer yourselves. Don't turn me down, it's not a bad thing. Not a bad thing? Openly opposing the Empire wasn't a bad thing? You need to get an answer from Guan Feng, don't you? Isn't that right? Gu Chang'an looked very happy. Both Silin and Bai Yi fell silent. Guan Feng's personal information was as follows. Imperial tutor, teacher of many royals and royals, one of the giants of AF1, senior academician of the Royal Academy of Sciences, director of a military research project. Every student of his is a famous figure in the Empire. And Guan Feng's personal influence is among the top few in the Empire. But he's actually one of the leaders of Black Viper. Go, you'll know the answer when you get there. Of course, you'll need to be strong enough to survive. After all, you're just 2 of the recommended people. Gu Chang'an switched images while saying this. This is the most basic information. You can use it as a reference. There were some species similar to the croc beasts on this gray planet, but they were much faster, had tough skin, and had quick reflexes. They were highly intelligent species. Other than that, there was also a new robot army and biosoldiers. Silin had seen a lot of biosoldiers in the past, and none of them had an absolute weakness. Some of them might be in the head, some in the heart, and some in other parts of the body. Their weaknesses could be determined by the distribution of their nerves after they mutated. On the other hand, when facing a biosoldier on the battlefield, one would not have the time to judge the distribution of the biosoldier's nerves. Huimao on Silin's shoulder wasn't looking at the monsters and biosoldiers at all. His attention was completely drawn to a couple of inconspicuous robots among the robot army. Why does it feel so familiar? These are just a few of the things you'll encounter. Here's a piece of advice. Familiarize yourself with the terrain. As long as you're familiar with the terrain, you'll have a life-saving trump card no matter what kind of opponent you run into. Neither Silin nor White Knight asked why they should trust him. Gu Chang'an was definitely telling the truth, but he was hiding a lot of things. It was exactly because of this that Silin and White Knight were caught between a rock and a hard place. If they didn't know so many secrets and Guan Feng's identity, they might be able to pretend that nothing had happened and continue their lives as if nothing had happened. But the problem was that they knew everything now. Therefore, there were only 2 paths in front of them. One was to betray Guan Feng, and the other was to betray the Empire. However, Silin also thought of another possibility. Without enough evidence, he couldn't say these speculations out loud. If he did, he would die. This wasn't the League of Stars, but the Miss Bodhisattva Empire. Under this kind of system, Sillin would face endless pursuit and assassination if he went public. No force would dare to accept him, and even Genya would become a sacrifice. Go find out the answer. Huimao desperately wanted Sillin to go, but he didn't tell Sillin about this. This place made him very uncomfortable, and the old man in front of him smiled like a fox. If you wanted to beat a fox, you had to be more cunning. Huimao admitted that he didn't have the intelligence to do so. Humans were a strange species, and their greatest success lay in their lies. That was the peak that Huimao couldn't learn even if he wanted to. If we're recommended by Teacher Guan, then what about you? Who did you recommend? Sillin asked Gu Chang'an. Me? Hee, I'll leave my post in peace. Gu Chang'an accepted the cup Chiaosu handed him and took 2 sips. Then he waved his hands. Go. Don't disturb this old man's peaceful life any longer. Sillin and White Knight exchanged a glance with each other, and decided to leave. Before leaving, Sillin asked Gu Chang'an, when is the deadline? There's no deadline, but it's best to prepare as soon as possible. The longer you drag things out, the more passive you'll be. Also, a word of advice. Don't look at Black Viper the same way you used to. After Sillin and White Knight left, Gu Chang'an looked at Chiaosu who was standing next to him. Do you blame me? Why didn't I recommend you for such a good opportunity? No, Grandpa. I'm the one who doesn't have the strength, Chiaosu replied calmly. Gu Chang'an let out a long sigh. You should give up when you need to. Don't ever hope for a position that doesn't belong to you. He then smiled and said, you should go with your parents when the time comes. The people in this term are pretty good. Will that person come too? Of course. They're choosing a blade for him. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.